Tacos at Jack are delicious. No, they are, Sean. I love the tacos. My only problem with the taco is a lot of the times you'll go to a certain ones like in the one in Marystown where it's just they give it to you cold. They're serving you fucking food that's cold. And I don't like it. Olvera Street, first stop. Boop boop. All right, guys. I think I'm out of here for tonight, man. But I'm gonna link Alien's page. So you guys can go hang out with Alien. You can rate his room again. Tell him I sent you. I sent you. Jesus Christ, can't even talk right now. So they close down on Vera Street at night, I guess. So they don't want people.
World was about to come to an end was when Jessica's teenage children informed her that prom had been canceled. Canceled? Jessica asked as she handed out bag lunches. What on earth for? Too many kids have the flu, Dylan, her 14-year-old, said. Jessica looked at Kayla for confirmation. 16 and about to attend her first prom, Kayla frowned. It sucks. That's because you won't be able to make out with Ethan now. Dylan made kissing noises to emphasize his point. Kayla swatted at him. Stop it. Both of you stop it, Jessica said. You're going to make me late for work. She loved her job as a dental hygienist, but now that she thought about it, a lot of patients had canceled due to illness. Maybe her family should stay home for a day or two. Let whatever bug that was going around pass them by. None of them could afford to get sick. Then she thought about Matt, her husband. He'd gone to work already. He was a software developer, and Jessica knew he'd been stressed with all the work he had on his plate. Maybe she could convince him to work from home, something he did from time to time. Sighing, she set her purse on the counter. Okay, family meeting. Wait, Dylan said. We can't have a family meeting without Dad. I know, but this is different. He's not here, and this seems like kind of what to do. But first, she needed to... Or was she trying to placate her? Either way, the thought of losing her mom tore her apart. Jessica... Time for an update. Matt turned up the volume. A man they'd never seen on that news station sat in the anchor's chair, his expression baggy with some... Brooke, what if she's sick? He sighed. Exactly what I was thinking. She sat up. Let's check on her. Through the door, Yeah, good idea. Together, they walked toward the kitchen where the door to the garage was. To their surprise, they found Kayla sitting on the floor, her back against the door. What's going on? Jessica asked, alarm in her voice. You didn't open the door, did you? The light over the kitchen sink was on, casting enough light to help Matt see Kayla roll her eyes. Of course not. I'm talking to her through the door. She glanced at the phone in her hands. And sometimes texting. She softly smiled. I have to talk kind of loud for her to hear me through the door, and I didn't want to wake you guys up. Her eyebrows tugged together. Did I wake you up? Matt shook his head. We were already awake. We came to check on Brooke. He sat on the floor beside Kayla. Jessica sat beside him. How's she doing? He glanced toward the door as he spoke. Not good, Kayla said, her face crumpling into tears. Matt couldn't help it. He recoiled. She's sick? What? Kayla asked. No, she's not sick. She's just really sad. Exhaling in relief, when he considered what it would feel like to lose his entire family, his heart lurched. Can we let her in? Kayla asked, her eyes filled with empathy. Not yet, sweetheart, Jessica said, which made Matt glad. He didn't want to be the bad guy. We have to wait 24 hours from when she got here. I know, Kayla said. I feel so bad for her. Loud sobbing from the other side of the door interrupted their conversation. Without thinking, Matt reached out and placed his hand on the door. We're here, Brooke. We're here for you. I know, Mr. Bronson, she said, her voice breaking. I'm sorry to be a bother. You're not a bother, Jessica said loudly. We're glad we can help you. We have to make sure you're not sick. I know. What's going on? Dylan asked, as he stumbled into the room, rubbing his eyes. I heard voices. We're talking to Brooke, Jessica said. Matt loved his family dearly, and he loved that they felt like a team, that they were all there together in the middle of the night, all thinking about the same thing. Well, maybe Dylan hadn't been thinking about Brooke, but still, he was there with them. Is she sick? Dylan asked around a yawn as he sank onto the floor near Matt. Matt ruffled Dylan's hair. I don't think so. The sun's coming up, Jessica said, as she stood. I'll get breakfast started. What about Brooke? Kayla asked. I'm sorry, sweetie, Matt said. She'll have to make do with the food Mom put out there. Kayla frowned, but she didn't argue. As the day went on, Matt checked on Brooke from time to time, speaking to her through the door. Kayla pretty much camped out beside the door. As the 24-hour mark came, Matt took Jessica aside. One of us needs to go into the garage and evaluate whether Brooke is sick or not. I'll go, Jessica said without hesitation. He shook his head. I should do it. Jessica narrowed her eyes. Why? Then she smirked. Do you have some special medical knowledge that I'm unaware of? He chuckled. You know I don't. She laughed. So, why you? He shrugged. Because I'm the one who let her in. She shook her head. No, that's not a good reason. Besides, I think she'd feel more comfortable with me. Matt couldn't disagree with that. All right, fine. But you need to wear a mask and gloves, just to be safe. Jessica nodded. Of course. Chapter 15. Jessica. Why had she volunteered to face a possibly sick person? Someone who could unwittingly kill her with a virus. Jessica tightened the mask around her nose and mouth as she tamped down her fear. She didn't want anyone in her family to take this risk, but she knew she would be careful. She put on goggles before pulling on a pair of gloves. Ready? Matt asked, as he stood beside her in the kitchen. Kayla and Dylan were there as well, their faces filled with anxiety. Yeah, she said, her voice muffled. Okay, he said, before walking toward the garage door. Jessica followed, her body tense with uncertainty. What if Brooke was sick? All day she'd claimed to be feeling fine, so maybe she was. Besides, if she'd gotten sick, chances were she would be on the verge of dying. That thought shook Jessica, and when Matt turned the deadbolt on the garage door, Jessica froze. Could she handle seeing a dead body in her own garage? especially one that belonged to her daughter's best friend. Chest tight, Jessica held up a hand to Matt, signaling for him to wait. "Do you want me to do it?" he asked, his forehead creased. She didn't want him to have to face this either. Besides, Brooke wasn't dead. She just said she felt fine. "No," she said, coming out of her paralysis. "I'm ready." She really wasn't, but this was her world now, and she would have to deal with whatever was placed in front of her. "Please stand back," Matt said through the door. "Okay," Brooke answered. Matt turned the doorknob and gently pulled the door open, staying away from the opening. Jessica's gaze went to the cavernous space beyond the door. She didn't see Brooke. Was she hiding because she was sick? What if she was lying in wait for Jessica, ready to infect her? Jessica had never heard reports of how those who were infected behaved once they were sick. Would Brooke go crazy on Jessica? With a glance at Matt, Jessica stepped over the threshold. The moment she cleared the doorway, Matt closed the door behind her. Thankful he hadn't locked the door, Jessica looked around the space. "Brooke?" she called out. "I'm over here," a soft voice said. Jessica looked to her left. That's when she saw her. Brooke stood near the door that led to the backyard, holding Cleo by the leash. Cleo leapt and panted, her tail wagging with delight. But Brooke's shoulders were slumped, and her face was incredibly sad. Empathy flooded Jessica. She took a step in Brooke's direction. From where Jessica stood, Brooke didn't look sick. "How are you feeling? I mean, are you sick?" Brooke shook her head. Then she burst into tears. That did it. Jessica walked swiftly toward Brooke with her arms outstretched. Brooke dropped Cleo's leash and raced into Jessica's arms, sobbing against her shoulder. Jessica had questions for her, but for now, she just held her. With Brooke in her arms, Jessica noted that Brooke wasn't feverish. That was a very good sign. Cleo pranced around them, clearly excited at being around a new person. Finally, when Brooke's tears began to slow, she drew away from Jessica, and Jessica got a closer look. Besides having a tear-soaked face, Brooke looked fine. "Let's go inside," Jessica said with a soft smile. Brooke nodded, then followed Jessica to the door. When they stepped inside, Jessica noticed that her family was standing back quite a distance, watching them enter, their eyes glued to Brooke. "She's not sick," Jessica stated. At that, everyone's faces relaxed, and Kayla went to Brooke and hugged her. Cleo had been at their house before, so she was familiar with the members of the Bronson family. So when Dylan called her over, she went to him happily. "I made space for you in my room," Kayla said to Brooke with a warm smile. The girls went down the hall to Kayla's room, Cleo on their heels. "Are you sure she's not sick?" Dylan asked. "I mean, how can you know for sure?" In reality, the only way to know was to wait and see. But it had been over 24 hours since Brooke had been around the virus, and she was healthy. Hopefully, that was good enough. "Nothing's sure anymore," Matt said, saving Jessica from having to explain. "But if she's not sick yet, I don't think she'll get sick." "I'm going to get dinner started," Jessica said, as she took off her mask, goggles, and gloves, then turned to walk into the kitchen. That evening at dinner, with Brooke eating with them, something she did quite often, it almost felt like a normal night. "I wonder what happened to Jack," Kayla said as she picked at the food on her plate. Jessica thought about their neighbor and the terrifying interaction Matt had had with him, the way Jack had hidden around the corner of the house, waiting for Matt to appear. "I don't know." Although she was fairly certain Jack's family had died, had he as well? "Maybe we should check with our neighbors," she said. "See who's still healthy." "Too dangerous," Matt said. "Well," Dylan said with a smirk, "we could, call them." Matt smiled. "Yeah, except I don't have their phone numbers. Do you?" They'd lived in their house for 2 years, but in that time they'd only gotten to know a few neighbors, and that was mostly when they happened to be outside at the same time as them. No, Dylan said with a frown. Wait, Jessica said. Kathy down the street gave me her number once. She got up from the table and dug around in the kitchen junk drawer before coming up with a slip of paper with a name and number. She held it up in triumph and smiled at Matt, who had a look of anticipation on his face, like he was eager to hear what was going on outside the 4 walls of their home, even if it was just a few doors down. Jessica listened as the phone rang, and rang, and rang. Was Kathy still alive? The thought that no one they knew still lived was eerie and unsettling. Hello? A soft voice answered. Kathy? Jessica said, as her gaze shot to Matt, who was listening intently. Yes? Who is this? Jessica put the phone on speaker and set it on the table so everyone could listen. It's Jessica Bronson. Your neighbor? A slight pause. Oh, yes. How are you? How's your family? Kathy was obviously wondering if Jessica was sick and if her family was alive. Relieved to be able to report that they were all well, Jessica opened her mouth to speak, but then wondered if Kathy would have news just as good. It seemed unlikely. Still, Jessica had to know what others were experiencing. We're good, she finally said. All of us. Then she glanced at Brooke, who met her gaze before casting her eyes toward the tabletop. I'm so glad to hear that, Kathy said, her voice hitching. What about you? A quiet sob filled the space. Dean didn't make it. Jessica pictured Kathy's husband. He'd always been so friendly and willing to help. The thought of him dying hit her hard. She swallowed the tears that threatened. I'm so sorry, Kathy. The rest of us are okay, though. Kathy had 2 teenaged boys. Jessica was thrilled that they were there for Kathy. She couldn't imagine how horrific it would be to lose her entire family. Then she thought about Brooke, who had lost her entire family. It was too much to comprehend, so she pushed aside all thoughts of it and focused on the conversation. Is everyone healthy? Jessica almost hated to ask. What if Kathy's family was sick? The fatality rate was 95%. If they were sick, they would most assuredly die. Yes, Kathy said, her voice sounding more confident. It's been 2 days since Dean, since he passed. As soon as he started feeling sick, he locked himself in the bedroom and wouldn't come out. Her voice choked up. Said he didn't want to expose us to the virus. It sounded like the tears were flowing freely. I guess it worked, because none of us got sick. He was a good man, Matt said. Quiet sobs were the only reply. Do you... Jessica began, then hesitated. Do you know what's going on out there? I mean, the news reports have stopped and there doesn't seem to be any information on what's happening in our area. Didn't you get a flyer? Kathy said, her emotions sounding more under control. A flyer? Matt asked, as he leaned closer to the phone. What flyer? Someone put flyers on all the doors earlier today about a meeting tomorrow afternoon at the elementary school down the street. That sounds like a bad idea, Dylan said, loud enough for all to hear. If anyone's sick, they'll get the rest of the people sick. Chapter 16. Matt. Matt agreed with Dylan. Putting healthy people in the same room as someone who was potentially sick sounded like a recipe for disaster. The flyer said not to come if you're sick, Kathy said. Yeah, like everyone carrying the virus would know they were about to get sick. Matt shook his head. Are you going to the meeting? Jessica asked. I don't know yet, Kathy said. One of my boys doesn't want me to go, but the other said we should. What about you? Are you going? Unlikely, Matt said. You probably should stay home too. I appreciate your concern, but I haven't decided yet. Matt sighed. Well, if you do go, will you tell us what you learn? Yes. Thank you, Kathy, Jessica said. Let's keep in touch, okay? That's a good idea. That is, I'm not sure how many people in our neighborhood are left. After an uncomfortable silence, they said their goodbyes and disconnected. I'm going to see if there's a flyer on our door, Matt said as he stood. He put on a pair of gloves before going to the door. Be careful, Jessica said as she followed him. Before opening the door, he looked out the front window to make sure no one was around. And when he felt confident that no one was, he unlocked the deadbolt, then opened the door a crack. A half sheet of paper fluttered to the ground. He opened the door wider, then used his foot to drag the sheet inside before locking the door once again. The flyer, he said as he picked it up and held it like it was an important document heralding critical news. What's it say? Jessica asked. He held it so they both could read it. It said pretty much exactly what Kathy had told them. He pointed to the line that said, "If you even suspect you may be sick, don't come." Can't be any more blunt than that. One side of Jessica's mouth turned up in a wry smile. They didn't even say please. Matt was glad that whomever had created the flyer, and was presumably running the meeting, had been crystal clear. This person was no nonsense, a quality he admired. Should we go? Jessica asked, her eyebrows bunched in question. I don't know. I'm leaning toward no. Besides, if Kathy goes, she can fill us in. Jessica nodded. True. He was glad she agreed with him. The last thing he needed was to have an argument over something so risky. I'm going to see what I can find online, he said, as he tossed the flyer and the gloves in the trash. The TV had only become good for entertainment. The only way to get news was on the internet, which Matt had been scouring for information. Not a lot of official updates. The main source of information was social media, but the claims were so outlandish. Whole cities were dead. This was a deliberate attack by a foreign country, and they would drop a nuke next. Hashtag end of the world. That Matt had a hard time believing much of what he read. Still, he searched. He had to take advantage of access to the internet while he could. He knew access wouldn't last. It couldn't. It was inevitable that the electricity would go off. With so many sick or dead, who was left to manage the power stations? So, after he tired of reading dubious reports posted by hysterical people, he spent the rest of his time printing off pages and pages of information about foraging for food, gardening, surviving off the land, and anything else he could think of. And then it happened. The next morning, the power went off. Moments later, Jessica burst into his office, where he'd been in the middle of putting his latest printouts into a binder that was nearly bursting at the seams. The power's off, she said, her eyes wide like she knew this was the end of civilization. I know. He didn't say this with sarcasm. Instead, he felt a deep sense of anxiety that took him by surprise. He'd been expecting this, yet it still shook him. Do you think it will come back on? I don't know, but I wouldn't count on it. The kids, all three of them, plus Cleo, joined him and Jessica in his office. I guess you noticed the power's off? Kayla said, her forehead creasing. Matt nodded, his gaze going to each of the kids, pausing on Brooke. She seemed to be adjusting reasonably well to being in their home. It also helped that she had Cleo with her. Matt had no idea what to do to make her feel at home, besides treating her like one of the family. To him, she was part of the family now, and he was happy to have her. So far, she was pitching in without being asked, and was generally pleasant to have around. Plus, having her there seemed to be keeping Dylan and Kayla from arguing like they sometimes did. "Yeah," he finally said in reply. "We noticed." "What's gonna happen now?" Dylan asked, his brow wrinkling. "Now," he said as he stood and faced the group, "we check the RV to make sure the power's working in there." "You have power in your RV?" Brooke asked with raised eyebrows. "Yeah," Dylan said, clearly proud that they had a solution. "How?" she asked, her gaze shifting to Matt. "There's a solar panel on the roof that powers the battery, and then there's an inverter that changes the battery power into 120-volt power, which is the same thing we have in the house. As long as the sun is shining, we'll have power. Although it's not like the house. We have to conserve." "So, at night, there won't be any power?" Brooke asked. "If we're careful with our usage during the day, the batteries will have enough juice to let us use the lights and charge our phones, but that's about it." Kayla's eyes lit up. "We can still use our phones?" Matt looked at her. "Yes, but I don't know how much longer cell service will be available. The carriers may no longer be up and running." Her face fell. "Oh." He thought about a bigger concern and couldn't hold back a grimace. "What's wrong?" Jessica asked. He didn't want to panic them, but they needed to know the score. "I'm concerned about how long water will flow." All 4 pairs of eyes widened in response. "That's why I filled the fresh water tank in the RV. Plus, I bought a lot of bottled water when I stocked up at Costco." Jessica's forehead furrowed. "I wonder what everyone else is doing about the power going out. And just in general," she frowned. "I feel so isolated here. We have no idea what's going on in our own neighborhood." Matt stared at her. "Are you suggesting we go to the meeting?" She shrugged. "I'm not sure. I mean, how else are we going to find anything out now that the power's out? What if help is coming? Or what if there's a vaccine? Or..." She shook her head. "If there's any news at all, we won't know. I mean, we can't rely on Kathy. We don't even know if she's going." He hated the idea of risking his family's health, but Jessica had a point. Sighing heavily, he nodded. "Okay, I'll go. Alone." Jessica shook her head. "You're not going alone. If you go, I go." He looked at her implacable face and knew there would be no talking her out of it. "Fine." With a grim smile, she nodded. Chapter 17. Jessica. As Matt pulled into a parking space, Jessica found herself gripping the armrest, her nerves stretched tight. It felt strange to be out of the house after not leaving for a week. Who would be at the meeting? Were so many people dead that there would be very few attendees? But when she looked at the cars parked in the lot, she was surprised to see more than she'd expected. "Masks on," Matt said, before putting an ear loop mask over his nose and mouth. Jessica felt slightly foolish coming to this meeting wearing gloves and a face mask. The last time she'd been in public was before the bird flu had taken hold. But life had shifted at a crazy angle since then. This was the new normal, and she doubted they'd be the only ones taking precautions. She put her mask on and turned to Matt. "Ready?" Her voice was slightly muffled. Side by side, they walked toward the entrance to the school, but when they reached the main doors, they saw a sign stating that the meeting had been moved from the auditorium to the playground. "Makes sense," Matt said through his mask. "With no power, it would be pitch black in the auditorium." They turned and headed to the playground, which was around the back of the school. "It'll be better to be outside," he added, as they rounded the corner of the school. "We can keep more distance between us and whoever else is there." "Good point." As they approached the playground, they saw people talking in small groups, many of them also wearing face masks. A few wore bandanas over their mouths and noses. Mildly surprised to see that, Jessica turned to Matt with a sardonic smile. Then she realized he couldn't see her mouth. Frowning now, she said, I guess a lot of people had the same idea we had. Somehow, that made her feel better, like the others were just as concerned as she and Matt were with staying healthy. Or they're sick and don't want anyone to know, he murmured. Alarmed at that idea, she slowed her pace. Matt urged her forward. We'll keep our distance from the others. She nodded, and they moved on, stopping a good 10 feet away from everyone else. A man was huddled with 2 other people at the edge of the playground. A moment later, he broke away and loudly said, "Can everyone hear me?" Everyone turned toward him, nodding. Jessica nodded too. She could hear him fine. There were no children at the meeting either, and once the man had spoken, everyone fell silent. She looked him over, trying to decide if she'd seen him before. He looked like he was in his 40s, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. He was average height, wore glasses, had a nice head of hair, and seemed confident in front of the group. And he wasn't wearing any kind of covering on his face. "Good," he said. "My name is Tony Webb. I head up the Neighborhood Watch program on my street." He chuckled. "That doesn't really mean anything, but I thought it might be helpful for us to get together as a neighborhood to discuss what we know and how we can help each other." His face became serious. "A lot of us have lost loved ones. I lost my wife and both my children." His chin quivered before he drew in a deep breath. "I buried all 3 of them myself." He was quiet a moment, then he sighed deeply. Finally, his gaze swept the assembled crowd. "I'm glad to see so many here. I'd wondered if anyone would come." Jessica thought about the man's courage in organizing this when he'd lost so much. "To start, let's discuss what we know." With a grimace, he said, "First, we know this flu is swift and deadly. Second, we know that the power has been off all day." One side of his mouth quirked up. "That's pretty much all I know." He looked at the group with expectation. "Does anyone else have any information?" One man held up his hand. Tony pointed to him. "Your name?" "Bryant Johnson?" "Okay, Bryant. What information do you have?" Bryant cleared his throat. "I'm a ham radio operator, and I've been spending a lot of time on there lately." That got everyone's attention. "Do you know what's going on in other places?" Tony asked. Jessica perked up. The news had been off the air for a few days, so she was intensely interested in what Bryant was going to say. She felt someone touch her arm. Startled, she turned to see Kathy standing there. Despite the fact that it might offend her neighbor, Jessica backed up a few steps. Matt did as well. Kathy didn't have a mask, and she'd had people in her family who'd had the virus. Jessica wasn't about to take any chances. "Sorry," Kathy said, obviously understanding why Jessica had backed away. She glanced toward Tony. "Have I missed anything?" Jessica shook her head, then gestured toward Bryant. "He was about to tell us what he's heard on his ham radio." Kathy nodded, then looked toward Bryant. "It's bad all over," Bryant said without preamble. "People are dying from the bird flu in droves. Stores are completely out of food, which is leading to riots and mass chaos. The power's out in most cities." He paused. "Things are really ugly." Jessica felt so isolated from all that. Besides their scary run-in with Jack several days earlier, they'd been safe and secure in their house. "What about around here?" someone asked, directing the question to Bryant. Bryant turned to the man who'd asked. "A lot of people didn't have more than a few days' worth of food, which has now run out." Bryant looked at the group. "People are getting desperate." He frowned deeply. "Desperate people do desperate things." Quiet murmurs filled the air as a sense of panic began to take over. "Let's not freak out yet," Tony said, settling the group down for the moment. "Let's focus on our group, our neighborhood." His lips compressed. How are all of you set for food and water? Jessica looked at Matt. She would leave it to him to decide how much information to share with these people. Chapter 18. Matt. Matt didn't know these people. They were neighbors, yes, but he didn't know them personally and wasn't ready to tell them that his family was well stocked up on food. Besides, he knew that many people in this area had been counseled by their church leaders to store a year's supply of food. He didn't know how many had done it, but he figured his neighborhood was better prepared than many others would be. He waited to see if anyone would share the information Tony had asked for. "We have sufficient for our needs," one man volunteered. "For now." Matt saw others nodding in agreement. Good. If people were self-sufficient, that would benefit them all. Maybe he could even trade his surplus for things he didn't have. "Is there anyone in need?" Tony asked, as his gaze swept the assembled group. A young couple raised their hands. "We're, the man began. "That is to say, we've only been married a few months, and money's been tight, so we haven't managed to be as prepared as we would have liked." Tony nodded, then looked around the crowd. "Would anyone be willing to donate a few things to this couple?" No one said anything. "Okay, how about this?" Tony looked at the couple. "Tell us where you live, and if anyone is so inclined, they can leave whatever they can spare on your porch." The young husband stated his address, then added, "I can trade. I'm good at fixing things." Tony nodded. "Excellent idea." Then he turned to the group. "Anyone else in need?" A few other people raised their hands. Matt quietly shook his head. He had mixed feelings. On the one hand, if people had spent more time and money preparing for an emergency rather than wasting it on fancy cars and toys, maybe they wouldn't be in need now. Then again, if Jessica hadn't called him that day, and if he hadn't stocked up at Costco, they'd be living off their freeze-dried meals by now. So he couldn't exactly judge anyone else. Tony held out his hand to someone nearby, and that person handed him a clipboard. "If you're in need," he said, holding up the clipboard, "write down your address and the skills you have, and I'm sure trades can be made." As several people approached to write their information down, Tony faced everyone else. "Do any of you have medical knowledge?" One woman raised her hand. "What about you?" Matt whispered to Jessica. She shook her head. "I don't think a dental hygienist counts." If she didn't want to say anything, he wouldn't push her. "Okay." "What are your qualifications?" Tony asked the woman. "I'm a physician, Dr. Maddie Larson." "Wonderful," Tony said as he jotted that down. Matt agreed. Having someone in the neighborhood who could treat injuries or illnesses would be invaluable. "Anyone in law enforcement?" No one raised their hands. "What about military experience?" Tony asked, his eyebrows raised in obvious hope. 3 men raised their hands. All appeared to be in their early 30s. "Excellent," he said with approval, as he wrote down their names. "What other skills does everyone have?" "I can fix pretty much anything," an older man offered. "I'm a mechanical engineer," another man said. 2 men announced that they were electricians. Everyone joked that that skill may or may not be useful now. "My husband's really handy," one woman stated, smiling at the tall man standing beside her. Tony nodded approvingly. "I have to say, with just this relatively small group, we have a decent number of critical skills covered." His gaze swept the small crowd. "Any hunters?" No one raised their hands. Tony frowned, then asked, "Any woodworkers?" Jessica nudged Matt. He turned to her with a frown, then realized she couldn't see his mouth. Finally, he raised his hand. All eyes swiveled in his direction. "Great! What's your name?" "Matt. Matt Bronson." As Tony wrote that down, he asked, "What kind of woodworking do you do, Matt?" Conscious that everyone was watching him and waiting for his reply, he cleared his throat. Mostly furniture. Beautiful furniture, Jessica added, loudly enough for all to hear. Despite himself, pride welled up inside him. The pieces he'd built, dressers, bookshelves, tables, were custom and extremely nice. Tony smiled. So, you know how to use tools? Yeah, but without power, most won't work. True, but knowledge is what I'm after. Then he turned to the group. Anyone with mechanical skills, like the ability to fix motors, cars, that kind of thing. One man raised his hand. After writing the man's name down, and with a wide smile, Tony said, I wasn't sure how this meeting would go, but after hearing all that you have to say, I propose that we work together as a neighborhood to provide security and food for our small neck of the woods. Heads nodded all around, and excitement welled up inside Matt. Before this pandemic, he'd never known his neighbors had so many skills. If he'd ever needed to hire someone to work on his house or car, he'd searched online to find people. Yet all along, people with those skills had been right here. And to think that they could pool their skill sets now to create a little community right here. It was an awesome feeling. I'm glad we came to this meeting, Jessica said beside him. He smiled at her, and though his mouth was covered, he knew his eyes reflected his feelings. And by the small crinkles around Jessica's eyes, she was just as excited about this as he was. If you all agree, Tony said, I'd like to meet again in a few days so we can talk about challenges we're facing. I'd love it if, together, we can come up with ideas on how to better organize our group. When everyone nodded in agreement, he smiled. We'll get flyers out again when we know exactly when we're meeting. He paused like he was considering his next words. I don't want to put anyone in danger, but if you're willing, maybe you can check on your neighbors who aren't here and see if, well, see how they're doing. Matt glanced at Jessica. She looked at him, her forehead creased. Okay, Tony said. See you next time we meet. What if we need help between now and then? Someone called out. What is your name, sir? Tony asked the man. Kevin? With a nod, Tony turned to the crowd. Any ideas on how to answer Kevin's question? Matt hadn't known what he'd expected out of this meeting, but he liked Tony. He was no nonsense, yet not a dictator in any sense of the word. He liked how Tony didn't purport to have all the answers. Anyone? Tony prompted with a smile that said he hoped someone had ideas. To Matt's surprise, he raised his hand. Matt, Tony said, with a smile that broadcast a bit of relief that someone had spoken up. What kind of help are you thinking of? Matt asked Kevin. Security, mainly? I mean, now that things are rapidly falling apart, I'm concerned about outsiders coming to our neighborhood and causing trouble. The thought had crossed Matt's mind, too. Then, thinking of Jack, he almost wanted to add, there could also be trouble from neighbors. Instead, Matt glanced at each of the men who'd said they had military experience. What would you suggest? The men looked at each other, then one of them said, if your family's threatened and you have a weapon, I suggest you use it. Some people nodded, others looked kind of horrified. Whether it was because they thought they might have to shoot someone, or because they couldn't believe society had come to this, he didn't know. Your name, sir? Tony asked the man. Derek. His voice was slightly muffled, as he had a bandana covering his mouth and nose, like some kind of outlaw. Can't we just call the police? One woman asked. Have you tried calling 911 lately? Jessica loudly asked. The woman looked at Jessica, then shook her head. All you'll get is a busy signal, Jessica said. That's if your phone even works, Derek said. Without power, you won't be able to charge your cell phone. And even if you could, service will most likely be unavailable, or will be unavailable soon. As loud conversation filled the air, Matt was doubly glad he'd bought the 9mm and the rifle. and was especially glad he'd stocked up on ammo. "I don't own a gun," one man said. Matt looked at Derek, who shook his head. "Don't know what to tell you, sir." "Maybe we can put together patrols," Matt said. He didn't know why he was speaking up. He was a software engineer, not a security expert. Then again, maybe it was because of his run-in with Jack. He didn't want to have to be on his own protecting his family. Safety in numbers and all of that. "Good idea, Matt," Tony said. Then he turned to the crowd. "Whoever's willing to be on patrol, please see Matt." Matt's eyes widened and his eyebrows shot up. Just because he'd suggested the patrols didn't mean he wanted to be in charge. Before he had a chance to object, most of the men and a few women turned and walked toward him. To his relief, the 3 military men were also approaching. He looked at Jessica, who looked back at him with raised eyebrows. Was she surprised because he would be in charge, or because so many people were headed their way? Chapter 19. Matt. Things were moving fast. They'd come to the meeting to observe, and suddenly Matt was responsible for security in their entire neighborhood? How had that happened? Glad they were wearing gloves and face masks. When he saw Tony walking toward them with his clipboard in hand, he couldn't hold back a smile. It felt good to be part of this group where everyone wanted to help. "Here you go," Tony said, as he passed the clipboard to Matt. Then he grinned, "in case you want to write anything down." "You don't actually think I should be in charge of security, do you?" Matt asked with a wry smile as he took the clipboard and pen. Then he remembered he was wearing his mask, so Tony wouldn't be able to see most of his facial expression. Tony grinned. "That's totally up to you." With a soft chuckle, Matt looked at the men and women approaching, his focus on the 3 guys who had military experience. "Which one of you wants to head up security?" he asked the 3. Derek glanced at the other 2 men, none of whom volunteered, then said, "I will." More than happy to hand it off, Matt held out the clipboard and pen. Derek waved it off. Feeling foolish for thinking Derek would need it, Matt handed it back to Tony, who raised his eyebrows as he took it. "First," Derek said, looking at all the people gathered around, "we need to monitor all major roads leading into our neighborhood. We need to control who has access. Second, we need to patrol in pairs, day and night, to keep an eye on what's happening." When everyone nodded in agreement, he gave a few pointers on what to look for when on patrol, and added, "You'll need to supply your own weapons." As he listened, Matt felt a sense of community. He didn't have to rely solely on himself. Others had expertise they were willing to share that would benefit all. "What if I don't own a gun?" a man asked. Derek shifted his gaze to the man. "Do you know how to use one?" The man shook his head. Matt thought Derek was frowning, but it was hard to tell since Derek wore a bandana. "Anyone else need weapons training?" Several hands went up. "All right," Derek said. "Meet here tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. sharp, and I'll provide training." "I'd like my teenagers to come," Matt said. Derek looked his way and nodded. "That's a good idea. The more people who know how to handle a weapon, the better." Matt could feel Jessica fidgeting beside him and knew she couldn't be thrilled with his idea, but he agreed with Derek. And if their family was threatened and he was incapacitated in any way, he didn't want his family to be helpless. "Who's ready to begin patrolling tonight?" Derek asked. Matt, along with several others, raised his hand. Derek nodded at Matt. "You and I will take the midnight to 4 a.m. shift." Then he assigned the other 2 military men with volunteers to take the earlier and later shifts. Though Matt wasn't excited to have to be up in the middle of the night, he was pleased to be paired with Derek. He had a feeling the man could teach him a lot. The meeting broke up a short time later. Matt took a look at the clipboard before they left. As they drove home, he was more than glad they'd come. "I'm going to the weapons training tomorrow," Jessica said, after she pulled off her face mask. Her statement took him by surprise, but he was pleased about it. Turning to her, he removed his mask as well. "Let's make it a family activity then." She smirked. "A little different from game night, but yeah, I think that's a great idea." "It'll be interesting to go on patrol with Derek. He seems to know what he's doing." Matt wholeheartedly agreed. "I have to admit," she added with a frown, "I'm a little nervous about being home with just the kids while you're gone." Her frown deepened, "especially with the power out." He didn't like the idea of leaving his family either, but then he had an idea. "Tell you what, let's use the power in the RV to charge up our walkie-talkies. That way you can contact me if you need me." He turned to her with a smile. "We'll just be in our neighborhood, so we should stay in range." With a look of relief, she said, "Great idea." A few moments later, they pulled into their driveway. The second they entered the house, the kids peppered them with questions. "How many people were there? Was anyone sick? What did you guys talk about?" Matt held up one hand. "Family meeting." At that, the 5 of them went into the family room and sat down. The kids looked nervous, like Matt was about to deliver bad news. To counteract that, he smiled. "Tomorrow morning at 7, you're all going to weapons training." "Yes!" Dylan shouted with a fist pump. But both Kayla and Brooke seemed less enthusiastic. "What for?" Kayla asked. "I don't like guns," Brooke said. "I'm going too," Jessica said with a soft smile. The girls looked at her, their mouths falling open. "Really?" Kayla asked. "Why?" Brooke said. "All right, Mom," Dylan said with a wide grin. "Time to take control of the conversation. All of us need to be comfortable with how to use a gun," Matt said. "The way things are heading," he let his sentence trail off. He didn't want to scare them, especially Brooke. She'd been through more than anyone should ever have to go through. But they needed to know the truth, needed to be prepared. To keep us safe, we all need to know how to use a weapon safely. Dylan's smile grew, if that was possible, but the girls looked even less certain. "I've never touched a gun before," Brooke admitted. Kayla looked at her friend. "Neither have I, but I guess..." She glanced at Matt before turning back to Brooke. "I guess it would be a good idea to, not be scared of them." Glad she was getting on board, Matt smiled. "You'll be trained by a military vet, Derek." "Derek Weathers?" Brooke asked. "Yeah, I think that was his last name." Brooke seemed to relax. "I know him. He lives 2 houses down and across the street from me." Her face fell. "Well, from where I used to live." "It's still your house, Brooke," Matt quietly said. Her gaze went to her lap, but she nodded. Wanting to take away the melancholy she was feeling, Matt said, "So, you know Derek?" She lifted her eyes and met his gaze. "Yeah, he helped my dad lay sod last year. He seemed like a nice guy." "I'll be going on patrol with him tonight." "Patrol?" Dylan said, smiling with enthusiasm. "Cool." Then he looked at Matt with undisguised hope. "Can I come?" "It's not up to me. Derek's in charge of security. But I suspect he'll want you to get that training before he'll let you come on patrol." "He's too young to patrol," Jessica said beside him, her tone urgent. "Carl was taking out bad guys when he was, 12. "Carl?" Jessica asked, her eyebrows furrowed. "Yeah," Dylan said. "On The Walking Dead?" Matt forced down a chuckle. "That's just a TV show," Jessica pointed out. "Maybe," Dylan said in reply. "But the world fell apart on that show, and it's falling apart now." True as that was, Matt didn't want Dylan to think this was all fun and games. This is real life, Dylan, not a TV show. We can't script how things go. Even good guys are going to get hurt. Jessica jabbed Matt in the side. He looked at her and saw her glancing meaningfully at Kayla and Brooke. Both looked extremely worried. That's why we're going to have patrols, he said, hoping to assuage their fears. To keep the bad guys away and keep our neighborhood safe. Which reminds me, Jessica said, standing. Let's charge up those walkie-talkies. Mom, Dylan said with a tone that said, duh. The power's off? Matt stood and tapped Dylan on the back. That's why we're going to use the RV's power. His face brightened. Oh, right. With that, the 5 of them, plus Cleo, trooped out to the RV. Chapter 20. Jessica. Once Matt unlocked the door to the RV and held the door for her, Jessica stepped inside and pressed the buttons to open the 3 slide-outs. The space became much larger. Even so, Jessica tried to imagine what it would be like if they had to live in the small space. All 5 of them, plus a dog. There was a small bedroom with a queen-size bed for her and Matt, and in the corner of the main space was a bunk bed with a double mattress on the bottom and a twin on the top. There was also a small table, a couch that converted into a bed, and a tiny kitchen. They'd been on dozens of camping trips in this RV, and they'd loved every trip, but it had always been nice to get home where they could spread out. With no power in the house, come winter, it was possible they'd need to sleep in the RV, assuming they had enough propane. If they managed to keep their propane tanks filled, they'd be able to stay warm. Cleo made herself at home, stretching out on the laminate wood floor in front of the couch. "Where are the walkie-talkies?" Matt asked, as he pulled open cabinets. "Right here," Jessica said, as she opened a drawer and took the walkies out along with the charging base. She set everything on the counter, and after Matt pressed the button to turn on the inverter, she plugged the base in. A tiny light glowed red, indicating that the charging base had power. Glad that they'd sprung for the solar panels and inverter when they'd bought the RV several years earlier, Jessica wondered what everyone in their neighborhood would do if they needed electricity for critical items. Then she wondered what would happen if everyone discovered that they had access to power. The thought sent a zing of panic up her spine. "Hey, guys?" she said, her voice tense. "What's up?" Matt asked, his eyebrows tugging together as he looked at her. "I think it would be best if we kept this," she swept her hand toward the charging walkie-talkies, "a secret." "The walkie-talkies?" Kayla asked, her nose wrinkled in confusion. "The electricity," Matt said. "I agree. This is information we need to keep on the down low." "Okay," Brooke said. "How come?" Kayla asked at the same time. "If everyone knows," Dylan said, "then everyone will want to use it." "Is that a bad thing?" Kayla asked. Jessica looked to Matt. He said, "If people find out, we'll have a line a mile long. It would tax the system. Besides, it would probably be for useless things like cell phones." "Useless?" Kayla asked, her eyes wide. "Why would a cell phone be useless?" "Do you have service?" Jessica asked, as she sat on the small couch. The last time she'd checked her phone was before the power had gone out, so she didn't know if service was even available. "Yeah," Kayla said. "Really?" Matt asked, as he took his phone from his pocket. He looked at his screen, tapped on an icon, then said, "I don't." Kayla grinned. "Well, I do." Then, to prove it, she took her phone out of her pocket and looked at the screen. "Wait." She tapped a few icons as panic swept over her face. "I did before." "I'm sorry, sweetie," Jessica said. "With the power out in so many places, it was inevitable that service would go out too." "That sucks," Kayla said, her face glum as she shoved her phone into her back pocket. "When power comes back on," Brooke said with hope in her eyes, "cell service will be back, right?" Jessica thought about the report Bryant had given, that power was out all across the country, and decided her children shouldn't have false hope. "If it comes back on, What do you mean? Kayla asked. It always comes back on. It's different this time, Matt said. Wait, Dylan said, like reality was just starting to sink in. It's not coming back on? Like, no more TV, no more video games? Jessica wouldn't miss TV or video games. Other things, critical things, would be much harder to go without. No more lights, no more washing machine, no more refrigerator, no more oven or microwave. That's right, Matt said, cutting into her thoughts. Too many people have, his eyes slid to Brooke before going back to Dylan, died. No more people to fix or maintain the electrical grid. The kids began listing all the things they would miss, and when Jessica realized that nearly every single thing she did relied on electricity, a sense of dread began sweeping over her. Okay, she said abruptly, cutting off Dylan's long lament over how hard it was going to be without video games. Everyone looked at her. Enough whining, because you're not even going to care about electricity if you have no food. Kayla's eyes widened. We have food. Dad bought a lot. A pinched look came over Dylan. We'll have to scavenge. Jessica hadn't meant to spark panic, but her children were focusing on the wrong things. We won't have to scavenge for a while, Matt said. We should be set for now, but we have to be careful. Wait, Kayla said, as she held up both hands. Are you saying we'll eventually have to scavenge? She looked horrified by the idea. It'll be cool, Dylan said. We can go into people's houses. One side of his mouth quirked up. I mean, the houses where everyone's dead, and we can take whatever we want. This conversation was all kinds of wrong. Jessica had to put a stop to it. Enough, she audibly sighed. Let's go back in the house. We need to better organize our food and update our inventory list. She looked at Matt. We need to keep better track of what we have. Good idea. Brooke held up her hand with a grimace. What's wrong, Brooke? Jessica asked with a soft smile. Speaking of food, I'm just about out of dog food for Cleo. Oh, do you have more at your house? Matt asked. She nodded. We have a lot. Dad? Her eyes filled with tears. They gave her the time she needed to get her emotions under control. He'd just gone to the store before... Jessica's eyes shifted to Matt. He looked back at her, and she knew he was thinking the same thing she was. That they could add the food from Brooke's house to their supplies. Matt looked at Brooke. We can go to your house and get Cleo's dog food. He paused. Would it be okay with you if we brought the food from your house here? Brooke smiled. Of course. I've been thinking we should do that, but I didn't know if you'd want to. Relieved she was okay with them basically raiding their house, Jessica went to Brooke's side and wrapped an arm around her shoulder. Then she looked at Matt. When do you want to go? His gaze went to each person. Right away. They stepped out of the RV. Matt brought up the rear, locking the door behind him. Chapter 21. Matt. Are you sure you want to come? Matt asked Brooke, as they prepared to take a trip to her house. She nodded. When Dad... She blinked several times. When he died, I buried him in the backyard. She dragged in a deep breath. And Mom, well, she died at the hospital. Amazed at her strength, Matt didn't know what to say. I didn't know about... Kayla said beside her. Well, about what you did with your dad. Nodding, Brooke smiled sadly at Kayla. We'd better get going, Matt said. It was getting late, and he wanted to get this taken care of right away. He kissed Jessica. Will you be okay here by yourself? They'd decided one person should stay behind to keep an eye on things. Jessica nodded. Yes. Besides, Cleo will be with me. That actually did make Matt feel better. He turned to the kids. All right, let's go. He led the way to the front door and out to his truck. When they pulled up to Brooks' house, Matt wasn't sure what he'd expected to find, but all was calm. No one was around. They got out and walked to the front door together. "I have the key," Brooks said. She inserted the key and disengaged the lock, then twisted the doorknob. The door swung inward. Matt waited. It was Brooks' house. She should go in first. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped inside, then turned to them. "Come in." They followed her in. "Where do you keep the dog food?" Matt asked. He wanted to get what they needed and get out. "In the pantry," she said, before leading the way. When Matt saw all the food they had in their pantry, he was more glad than ever that he'd asked if they could gather her food to bring it back to their house. "Do you have any boxes we can use?" he asked Brooke. She looked like she was working hard to hold her emotions together. "Yeah, we have some plastic buckets in the basement." Out of habit, Matt flipped the light switch at the top of the stairs to the basement. Nothing happened. "I've got it, Dad," Dylan said. Then he turned on a flashlight. It was going to be hard to get used to no electricity. Brooke led the way, showing them where the plastic buckets were, as well as the small amount of food they had stored down there. A few cans of flour and rice sat on the shelves. Matt's eyes widened in pleasant surprise. He'd been worried about having an extra mouth to feed, but Brooke's contribution would certainly go a long way to mitigate his concern. With Brooke's permission, Matt looked around the house for other supplies they could use. He gathered blankets, vitamins, and other medications, as well as some hand tools Brooke's father kept in the garage. With everyone's help, it took 20 minutes to load all of the supplies into his truck. Brooke took some time to gather her most precious personal belongings, and then they drove back to their house. Matt backed into the garage, and everyone pitched in, carrying all the goods into the house. "Wow," Jessica said with a smile, as he set a large plastic bucket filled with food on the kitchen counter. "This will really help." "I was thinking," Matt said, as he surveyed their bounty before looking at each member of the family. "We have so much, and so many others are in need. What if, I don't know, we brought some to those who need it?" Jessica smiled. "I think that's a great idea." She looked thoughtful. "Maybe that young couple from the meeting." He grinned. "I was thinking the same thing." One eyebrow arched. "I saw their address on the clipboard." "What if we doorbell ditch them?" Kayla said. "Like, put it on their porch, then run away." Dylan's hand shot up. "I'm the fastest. I should do it." They all laughed. "Okay," Matt said. "We'll sneak over there right before dark." "Shouldn't we go after dark?" Dylan asked. Matt shook his head. "I don't want to scare them by knocking on their door too late at night." "Aw," Dylan said, his face serious. "Makes sense." Brooke nodded. "This is going to be awesome." As the sun was beginning to set, Matt and his family got in his truck. Each of the 3 kids held a small bag with a variety of canned and other non-perishable goods. In the end, they decided to drop off food to the homes of 3 families, the young couple and 2 families they knew had small children who'd raised their hands that they were in need. In all reality, it wouldn't go far, but the idea of doing what he could for his community felt right to Matt. It didn't take long to drop the food on the porch, knock on the door, then dash away. And by the time they got home, they were all feeling much better about life in general. Chapter 22. Matt. Just before midnight, Matt set a charged walkie-talkie by Jessica's side of the bed, then leaned over and gave her a lingering kiss. "If you need anything, let me know." "Do you have to go?" She sat up and looked at him, her forehead furrowed. Though some moonlight trickled in through the open blinds, it was still quite dark. Without street lamps to cast their light into the room, it felt eerie. He knew she was nervous about being left on her own, but he'd committed to patrol with Derek for the next 4 hours. "I'm sorry," he said, as he sat on the edge of the bed. Derek's counting on me. Softly sighing, she glanced at the walkie, then met his gaze. I know. Try to go back to sleep. She chuckled at that. Fat chance. He reached out and gently stroked her cheek. I won't be far, just around the neighborhood. She nodded, then pulled him in for another kiss. You're making it hard to leave, he murmured against her lips. Quietly laughing, she said, Good. He drew away before standing. My shift is done at 4. She nodded. Be safe, Matt. I love you. I love you too. He turned and left the room, then went downstairs to gather what he needed, including a loaded .45 with an extra magazine. As he put the pistol in his inside-the-waistband belt holster, he felt strange. As a concealed carry permit holder, he'd bought the holster long ago, but he hadn't really used it all that much. Now, though, knowing he may need his weapon to protect his neighborhood, putting his pistol in the holster felt like a whole new level of responsibility. Holding back a sigh, he shrugged into his jacket before putting the extra magazine into one of the pockets and the walkie-talkie into the other. Then, after affixing the ear-loop mask over his mouth and nose, he headed out the door, locking the deadbolt behind him. Walking toward the rendezvous point, the corner of a nearby street, he couldn't help but notice how abnormally quiet it was. No hum of a street lamp or other mechanical things. No cars driving by. No porch lights to emit light across yards. A lone dog barked as Matt walked past a pitch-black house. How many pets had died from starvation because their owners had died of the virus? The thought made him inexorably sad. He was glad they'd taken Cleo in. She would be an asset to their home, an extra level of defense. Don't move, a deep voice said next to his ear as something hard pressed against his neck. Was it a gun? Was he about to be shot? Frozen in place, Matt thought he was going to wet himself. Volunteering to come out in the middle of the night alone during the early days of the apocalypse? What had he been thinking? He was no hero. He was just a man trying to protect his family. Then it occurred to him. His family was alone. Who was this person, and were others with him? Was his family in imminent danger? He had to get back to them, had to protect them. Adrenaline dumped into his veins, and without thinking, he spun away from his attacker, ready to fight for his life. When Matt saw who was standing there, his mouth fell open. Derek? He wasn't wearing the bandana over his mouth and nose. Derek scowled and shook his head. You need to gain situational awareness, Matt. If I'd been a bad guy, you'd be dead. Was that why he'd done that? To wake Matt up? To scare him? Fury, powerful and swift, slammed into Matt, and it took everything in him not to come at Derek. Then again, he had the distinct feeling that Derek could easily take him down. Instead, he glared at him. Did you have a gun pressed to my neck? Maybe the guy was mentally unstable. Derek smirked and held up his black-gloved hand, his middle and pointer fingers squeezed together. He'd only been pressing his fingers into Matt's neck, not a gun. Though still angry, Matt felt his fury drain away, replaced by embarrassment. He'd nearly wet himself over a finger pressed to his neck. Not cool. Derek made a scoffing sound. What's not cool is you walking along like you're still in your safe little neighborhood, not paying attention to anything around you. Anyone could have come up to you and... He shook his head. I'm not going to go into all the ways you could have been compromised. One side of his mouth quirked up. I think you got the idea. As annoyed as Matt was, he couldn't fault Derek for making a very convincing point. He reminded himself that when Derek had told him they would partner on patrol, Matt had been eager to learn from him. Well, that was certainly happening. Yeah, Matt said. You made your point. Derek chuckled. Good. He gestured with his head in the direction Matt had been walking. "We'll head up Rosewood Drive to start." Evidently, Derek had a plan, so Matt simply nodded and began walking beside him. "Look, man," Derek said with a sardonic laugh and talking in a quiet voice. "Sorry if I scared the crap out of you." Not wanting to admit that he'd almost peed himself, Matt forced a quiet laugh of his own. "I'll get over it." Derek nodded, but his attention was on the neighborhood. "You gotta keep your head on a swivel at all times." "Right." All was silent in the neighborhood, not even the flicker of candlelight in any of the windows. Of course, it was after midnight, so everyone was probably asleep. Matt's gaze swept across all of the houses within view, many with a red X on the door. "How many bodies do you think are in these houses?" Derek looked at him sharply as they walked, staring at him for several moments before going back to probing the neighborhood with his eyes. "Too many," he finally murmured. "Do you think we ought to, I don't know, do something about them? The bodies, I mean." As Matt spoke, his eyes were in constant motion. No way was he going to let someone sneak up on him again. "Like what? Bury them? Burn them?" Derek snorted a laugh. "You can bring it up at the next neighborhood meeting. Maybe Tony will put a committee together." "That's actually a good idea." They reached a cross street. Derek paused on the corner, slowly looking in each direction. Finally, they began crossing the street, but Derek never stopped looking. If this was how Derek operated, and if he trained the others to be as vigilant, their neighborhood would be one of the safest places around. Matt's walkie-talkie squawked in his pocket. Then Jessica, her voice urgent, said, "Matt! Matt! Are you there?" Chapter 23. Matt. Ignoring the look of surprise on Derek's face, Matt yanked the walkie out of his pocket and pressed the button to reply. "I'm here. What's wrong?" "I heard a noise outside, and when I looked out the window, I saw something moving, and Cleo's barking like crazy." Matt could hear the barking. "Are the kids in the house?" "Yes, they're right here with me." Matt glanced at Derek, who nodded once. "Okay, we'll be right there." Matt dropped the walkie into his pocket and spun around, taking off at a fast jog. They were about half a mile from his house. 4 minutes later, they approached Matt's house. Matt was panting, but Derek was breathing normally. Half annoyed, but also grateful to have him there, Matt stopped beside a thick tree trunk, 2 houses away from his own, then bent over to catch his breath. "How do you want to do this?" "First, turn off your walkie. You don't want to give your position away." "Right." He pressed the button and whispered, "Jess, I'm here. Are you okay?" "Yes." "I'm going to turn my walkie off for now." "Okay." He shut it off, then stuffed it in his jacket pocket. Derek gave him a long look. "If someone's in your yard, are you prepared to shoot, knowing the person will most likely die?" That gave him pause. Was he ready to be responsible for the death of another person? Then he pictured his family. Would he kill in order to protect them? Unequivocally, yes. "If the person presents a threat," he said. "Yes." Derek tilted his head. "How will you decide if the person presents a threat?" Matt had no idea. How do you decide that kind of thing? The sound of glass shattering filled the air. Both men jerked their heads in the direction of Matt's house. "I think it came from the back of my house," Matt said, as his heart slammed against his ribs. Without another word, Derek pulled a gun out of a holster and took off toward Matt's house. Matt took the .45 out of his holster and raced after him. Moments later, they stood outside the gate to Matt's backyard. Derek held a finger to his lips. Then he gave hand signals, which Matt took to mean that Derek would go through this gate, while Matt should go through the gate on the other side of the house. Nodding, and with his heart going 100 miles an hour, Matt made his way across the front of his house across the driveway, and to the gate on the other side. Drawing in a deep, lung-filling breath before slowly exhaling, he forced himself to calm down. Then he quietly unlatched the gate before slowly pushing it inward. On the lookout for an intruder, he peered around the edge of the gate, his gaze shooting in all directions. "On the ground!" he heard Derek shout. Alarmed that there actually was someone in his yard, Matt hustled through the side yard and around to the back to find a man on the ground with Derek's knee in his back. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, so it was impossible to see who the man was. Grateful that he hadn't had to deal with this on his own, Matt watched as Derek expertly zip-tied the man's wrists behind his back. "Who is it?" Matt asked. Once the man was restrained, Derek rolled him over and shone a flashlight into his face. The man squeezed his eyes closed against the bright light. "I don't know his name," Derek said, "but he was at the meeting today." Now that he mentioned it, Matt remembered seeing the man at the back of the group of security volunteers. "What's your name?" Matt asked as he squatted beside him. Fear shone from the man's eyes. Charlie Swenson." "What are you doing in my backyard, Charlie?" Matt felt a mixture of anger and confusion. He lifted his gaze to the now broken window in his dining room, then he scowled at the man. "And why in the heck did you break my window?" I was desperate," Charlie began. "My family's starving and I needed food." "What made you think I had any?" You didn't raise your hand to say you needed anything, so I figured." He did a half shrug. Still confused why he had been a target, Matt said, "So did a lot of people. I knew you'd be on patrol, so I thought I'd..." He let his words trail off. Realizing that Charlie had planned to break into his home when he wasn't there and when his wife and children would be asleep and vulnerable, Matt felt an overwhelming rage descend over him. What if Jessica had caught him? Would he have hurt her? Killed her? And what about Kayla and Derek and Brooke? Without thinking, he pressed his gun to Charlie's temple. "I should shoot you right now." His teeth were clenched as he spoke. "Matt," Derek said beside him, breaking through his rage. With his gun still buried in Charlie's forehead, Matt lifted his gaze to Derek. Derek glanced meaningfully at the gun, then raised his eyebrows. Shocked to realize he'd been on the verge of killing a man in cold blood, Matt pulled the gun away from Charlie's head. Charlie exhaled loudly, his breath ragged, his eyes on Derek. "Thank you." Making a scoffing sound, Derek shook his head. "Don't thank me. I'm going to lock you up and let the neighborhood decide what to do with you." "Is there anyone else with you?" Matt asked, his mind still racing and his heart still pounding. "No," Charlie said. "It was just me." Matt looked at Derek. How could they be sure Charlie wasn't lying? What if someone else was waiting to make a play once Matt and Derek left? Derek pressed a forearm against Charlie's throat. "You wouldn't lie to us, would you, Charlie?" Charlie mouthed the word no and shook his head, at least as much as he could, with Derek's powerful forearm crushing his throat. Tears filled the man's eyes. Derek glanced at Matt, who nodded. He believed him. Derek lifted his arm, and Charlie gasped for breath. "I'm sorry," Charlie said, his voice strained. "I'll do whatever you guys decide. I know it was wrong. I was just..." His face crumpled. "My family hasn't eaten in days. They're starving." Though Matt felt sorry for him, he was also furious with the solution Charlie had chosen, which put his family in danger. "You could have traded for food." I don't have any skills to trade." Matt shook his head. "Get up," Derek said, as he roughly pulled the man to his feet. Matt wondered what they were supposed to do with him now. They couldn't call 911. not without cell service, not that anyone would answer. Besides, as far as he knew, the police were no more. Chapter 24. Jessica. Stunned to see her husband pointing a gun at a man. No, he was doing more than pointing. He looked like he was going to shoot him. Jessica held her breath as she peered around the edges of the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. "What's happening?" Dylan asked from behind her. She'd made the children stay back, and now she was glad. She didn't want them to see their father killing a man. Then she saw Matt look at Derek before taking the gun away from the man's head. Exhaling in relief, when she saw Derek pull the man to his feet, she unlocked the door and slid it open before stepping onto the patio. "Matt?" she said, as her gaze went to the man whose hands were tied behind his back. "What's happening?" Matt looked at her, his face a kaleidoscope of emotions. "We've got it under control," Derek said. "Whoa," Dylan said from beside her. "What's going on?" Kayla asked. "Is Dad okay?" With a glance at her daughter, Jessica said, "He's fine." Matt stepped toward her, and she rushed forward, overwhelmed by all that had happened, was still happening. He drew her into his arms. Savoring the feeling of security his embrace sent over her, Jessica whispered, "What happened?" Matt pulled away and looked at her with a frown before telling her about the man, Charlie, someone from their own neighborhood, had planned to break in and had gotten as far as breaking a window. Shocked, Jessica looked at the man, vaguely recalling him from the earlier meeting. "What's going to happen now?" Matt looked at Derek, who said, "Your husband and I will take him somewhere where he can't cause trouble. In the morning, the neighborhood will have to figure out what to do with him." Jessica shifted her eyes to Matt. She spoke in a low voice, so the kids couldn't hear. "You're leaving me alone? Now? What if..." She looked at Charlie. "What if someone else tries to do the same thing?" Guilt and concern swept over Matt's face, but before he could speak, Dylan placed a hand on her arm. "I'll keep you safe, Mom." "No," she said as she turned to him. "That's your father's job." Dylan's eyebrows pulled together. "He has to patrol." "Dylan's right," Matt said, which annoyed Jessica. Yes, she cared about the neighborhood, but didn't Matt think his own family came first? "Look," Derek said to the group, "I'll grab someone else to take Matt's shift. Tonight." Relieved, Jessica smiled at Derek. "Thank you. I suggest you come to the weapons training tomorrow," he added, his gaze right on Jessica. "I was already planning on it." Hating the feeling of being helpless and vulnerable, she was determined to learn how to protect herself. Derek grinned, his teeth gleaming white in the moonlight. "Awesome. See you in the morning." With his hand firmly gripping the man's arm, Derek walked out of their yard and into the night. Kayla pointed to the broken window. "Can we cover that up?" Matt frowned. "I don't think I have enough plywood, but I'll check." With flashlight in hand, he went inside with Dylan right behind him. Jessica led the girls inside, and a few minutes later, Matt was back with a small sheet of plywood. "You had one?" Jessica asked, grateful her husband enjoyed woodworking, which is why he had random pieces of wood on hand. "Yeah," he said, "but it'll only cover half of the broken window." "Better than nothing," she said, although the idea of anyone being able to climb through the glass without them knowing set her nerves on edge. Matt must have thought the same thing, because he said, "I'll keep watch tonight, and tomorrow we'll get more plywood." Too tired to think about what they needed to do the next day, Jessica nodded, and after Matt and Dylan nailed the plywood over half of the broken window, she gave Matt a kiss, then led the kids upstairs, where they all went to bed. It took a while for her to settle back in for the night, especially without Matt by her side, but eventually she drifted off. Early the next morning, when the sun streamed through the window, she woke abruptly. She hadn't slept well. She'd been on high alert all night, listening for any sounds that didn't belong. And with the power out, every little creak of the house woke her. But now, in the light of a new day, she felt better, less worried. At breakfast, as the five of them sat around the table eating, Jessica turned to Matt. Should one of us stay here and, I don't know, guard our supplies? I mean, after last night, I'm worried that someone else will try to break in. Matt, who looked exhausted after keeping watch most of the night, nodded. I was thinking the same thing. You and the kids go to Derek's training. I'll stay here and keep an eye on things. Though Jessica would have preferred that Matt come with them, she knew his suggestion was the best one. She and the kids needed this training. How else to defend themselves in their home? She placed her hand on his and smiled. All right. Can you ask Derek to stop by later? Matt asked, as she and the kids were walking out the door. Sure. Wearing face masks, Jessica and the three kids walked the half-mile to the school. When they arrived, Jessica saw a small group of people, many of them wearing something over their mouths and noses. Jessica wondered if the virus was still running rampant or if it was burning itself out. Everyone, circle around, Derek called out to the small crowd, his mouth and nose covered by a bandana. A number of different-sized guns were lying on a small table beside where he stood. Once it looked like everyone had arrived, he began. Rule number 1, he said, as he lifted a gun from the table and pointed it at the ground. Always assume a gun is loaded. Everyone listened with rapt attention as he discussed several other safety tips, and then let each person who wanted to take a turn holding whichever gun they wanted. When it was Dylan's turn, Jessica could see how excited he was to get his hands on a gun. Partly glad he wasn't afraid, but also wishing he was, at least a little. She watched as Derek worked with Dylan one-on-one on how to check to see if a bullet was in the chamber, which it wasn't, and how to rack the slide. Can we practice shooting? Dylan asked, his eyes alight with interest. Good question, Derek said. Then he faced the group. The best way to become comfortable with firearms is to use one. I'll scout out a place where we can safely have target practice. He pointed to a clipboard on the table. If you're interested in target practice, write down your name and address, and I'll make sure you're informed of where and when. When the lesson was over, Jessica waited until everyone who wanted to talk to Derek had left before she approached him. Where's Matt? He asked as he loaded his guns into a bag. After what happened, we decided it would be a good idea to, guard our supplies. Derek frowned, then nodded. Yeah, I can see why you'd want to do that. She pictured the man who'd nearly broken into her house. Where's Charlie? In a secure location. Jessica had no idea what that meant, but obviously Derek didn't want to get into the details, so she just nodded. Matt wanted me to ask if you'd stop by our place. He hefted his bag over his shoulder. Sure thing. Chapter 25. Matt. When a knock sounded at the front door an hour after Jessica and the kids had returned from their training with Derek, Matt's heart hammered in his chest. Was it Derek, or someone who would cause Matt and his family trouble? He'd been dozing on the couch, but the confident knock had jerked him awake. I'll get it, he said to Jessica as he stood. She and the kids were in the kitchen stocking the pantry with food from the basement storage room. He and Jessica had been trying to figure out a way to secure their supplies so that they could leave the house without guarding it. So far, they hadn't come up with a good idea. With a slight sense of trepidation, Matt approached the front door. Who is it? He called out. Derek. Relieved, Matt unlocked the door and pulled it open. Thanks for coming by. What's up? Matt invited him in, and Derek stepped inside. Neither of them were wearing coverings on their faces, but Matt felt confident that Derek wasn't sick. I need to get some plywood for my broken window. Not sure how Derek would respond to his idea, Matt hesitated. Then he glanced toward the kitchen. He hadn't told Jessica his idea either. I was thinking you and I could make a trip to Home Depot. He spoke softly so Jessica wouldn't hear. No reason to get her upset until he was certain they were going. Derek's eyebrows shot up. Then he glanced in the direction of the broken window. I had enough plywood to cover half the window, Matt said, but that's not going to work. Derek rubbed his jaw, then he exhaled before nodding. Yeah, I'll go. I can pick up a few things myself. Elated that he would have a strong ally with him, Matt grinned. Sweet. Derek chuckled. You might change your mind once we get there. Matt tilted his head. Why do you say that? It just might be a bit different than the trips to Home Depot you're used to. I mean, I doubt they're actually up and running. Truth be told, Matt had assumed the same thing, but it was hard to picture what it would actually be like. Right. When do you want to go? Now? Okay. Derek looked thoughtful. We'll take my truck. That was fine with Matt. We'll need to carry. Matt knew he meant they would need to bring guns. He already had his .45 in his waist holster. After all the craziness with Jack and then Charlie, he wanted to be ready for anything. You think we'll need to use them? The thought was kind of nuts. He was running a quick errand, not going to war. Derek's shoulders lifted in a shrug. Gotta be prepared for anything. Matt nodded. I just need to tell Jessica where I'm going. He knew his tone broadcast that this trip would be news to his wife. Derek's eyebrows shot up. Okay, I'll be out front. After Derek left, Matt went into the kitchen. Jessica was on a step stool, putting cans on the highest shelf. How's it going? He asked. Good, she said as she turned around. What did you want with Derek? Here goes. He's gonna help me get some plywood. Her face brightened. Great! Does he have some we can use? Not exactly. Her eyes narrowed. What aren't you telling me? The kids all stopped what they were doing to watch the exchange. Derek and I are going to Home Depot. Oh, can I go? Dylan asked. No, he and Jessica both said at the same time. Puffing out a loud sigh, Dylan turned back to taking cans of carrots out of a box and placing them on the counter. Jessica came around the counter and walked into the family room, motioning for Matt to follow. Is that safe? She'd kept her voice low so the kids wouldn't hear. He didn't want her to worry, but he wasn't going to lie. I don't know, but that's why I wanted Derek to come. Her lips pursed. Is there any other way? Besides knocking on every door in the neighborhood to see who has plywood they'll hand over? No. Her shoulders drooped, like she knew going to Home Depot was the best option. Then she threw her arms around him. Please be careful. I will, he murmured in her ear. She stared at him a moment, then smiled. Can you pick up packets of vegetable seeds? Matt chuckled. Anything else? Potting soil and seed starting trays? Will do. He gave her a kiss, then after grabbing 2 face masks, 2 pairs of gloves, and 2 flashlights, he went out front and walked toward Derek's truck. It was an older truck, not fancy or expensive. In fact, Matt could see a spot of rust here and there. There was a hard shell over the bed of the truck. He just hoped the engine was in decent shape. Though the Home Depot was only a few miles away, he didn't want to have to carry a sheet of plywood home. He climbed inside the truck and held out a face mask and a pair of gloves to Derek. They both put them on. Then Derek turned on the engine and pulled away from the curb. As they drove out of their neighborhood, Matt was struck by how quiet everything was. No one was outside on this beautiful April morning. But even more striking was the lack of cars. Normally, there would have been moderate traffic. It was spooky. Weird that no cars are on the road, Matt said. Yeah, Derek said. When was the last time you were out of our neighborhood? Matt glanced at Derek, then went back to looking out his window. I guess about 5 days ago, when I figured out how bad this flu was, I decided to hunker down at home. Matt turned and looked at Derek. With your family? Derek smiled. I'm single. Where are your parents? His jaw clenched. Los Angeles. But, last time I spoke to them, they were both sick. They both knew what that meant. I'm sorry. Derek nodded. Both men were quiet as they turned onto the road that led to Home Depot. A block away from Home Depot, Derek pulled to the curb and shut off the engine. We should approach on foot, he said. See what's what. Matt nodded. Derek had combat experience, whereas Matt's experience was sitting in front of a computer pounding out code. Yeah, he'd defer to Derek. They climbed out of the truck and made their way to the parking lot, keeping close to the fence. Moments later, the parking lot came into view. A handful of cars were parked there, but not a soul could be seen. Across the parking lot was a Best Buy electronics store. The glass doors that led inside were smashed. Derek did a chin lift in that direction. Idiots looted an electronics store. He snorted a laugh. Now they can stare at their big screen TVs that don't work. He shook his head and moved forward, keeping close to the building. As they got closer to the sliding doors, they saw that they were smashed as well. Matt wondered what the looters had left. He hoped there would be at least one sheet of plywood. When they reached the doors, Derek, who was leading, stopped. Matt stopped behind him. Then, with his pistol at the ready, Derek stepped through the opening made by the broken glass. After a brief hesitation, Matt followed. After the bright sun, the interior was dim, but with the skylights in the ceiling, he could still see well enough. Derek had stopped just inside the door, so Matt stopped beside him. Home Depot was a home improvement enthusiast's dream. A giant warehouse with aisle after aisle of hardware, tools, and other supplies for repairs, construction, and any other project around the house. Matt's gaze swept the immediate area. It looked like looters had made a mess of the store, throwing what they hadn't taken onto the floor. As Matt frowned at the mess, he felt Derek tap his shoulder. He looked at Derek, who touched his ear. That's when Matt heard it. The sound of people doing something somewhere in the enormous store. They weren't the only ones inside. Chapter 26. Matt. Derek motioned to the right, then he pointed at Matt and motioned to the left. With a nod, they split up, and as Matt moved to the left, he gripped his .45, keeping his finger off of the trigger, but at the ready. The last thing he wanted was to shoot someone, but things were different now. Law and order had broken down. He would do what he had to do. As he made his way down the main aisle, his ears strained to tell where the activity was coming from. He wasn't going to lie. He hoped Derek would come across the person or people first. He was much better equipped to handle conflict, but Matt knew he had to learn. Things were only going to get tougher, and with law enforcement non-existent, he would have to up his skills to include defense. "Toss that over here," he heard a man call out, followed by a loud thump. How many were there? More than one, it seemed, and they were close. Matt moved forward, and when he remembered the way Derek had snuck up on him the night before, he kept his head on a swivel. Movement caught his eye. He eased closer, peering around the end of an aisle. Two men were at the other end, loading a ladder onto a flatbed cart that was already filled with a variety of other items. Maybe they were like him, needing a few things to secure their homes. Harmless. "What do you think you're doing?" a man said from right behind Matt. Then Matt felt something cold and metal pressed into the base of his skull. This time, it wasn't someone's fingers. Squeezing his eyes closed, Matt's first thought was that Derek was going to kill him for not having enough situational awareness. But he'd been paying attention, so how had this man snuck up on him? And how dangerous was he? "Drop your gun," the man said. Matt had almost forgotten he was holding his .45. Without arguing, he let it fall to the floor. "Kick it away from you." He did. "Now, turn around slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." This man was all business. Would he shoot him? Heart slamming against his ribs. Where was Derek? Matt slowly turned to see a man who looked to be in his 40s, slightly overweight, with short hair and glasses. Not your typical bad guy. The man pointed his gun at Matt. "Why are you spying on us?" All Matt could see was the huge black barrel aimed directly at him. He imagined the bullet coming straight out and killing him instantly. Terror wound its way up his throat, and he found it hard to push words past his teeth. The man jerked the gun toward him. "Answer me!" I need some plywood." The man furrowed his brow and tilted his head. "What?" Now that he'd found his voice, he felt his confidence growing. "I need a sheet of plywood. That's all." Where was Derek? Using his gun, the man gestured to another part of the store. "You're in the wrong department." He chuckled at his own joke before adding, "I ought to shoot you right now." He laughed, and the sound was filled with menace. "This here is the Wild West. I can do whatever I want, and there's no one to stop me." The man spit on the ground at Matt's feet. "Least of all, you." "I don't want any trouble," Matt said. "Just a sheet of plywood." The man squinted at him. "What do you need it for?" He didn't want to get into a conversation about how his house had been broken into. "I just do. Now, if you'll excuse me." The man laughed. "No, I won't excuse you. In fact, I think you need to meet some friends of mine. You can tell us all about where you're from, who else is in your group, what supplies you have, that kind of thing." No way was Matt going to do that. He shook his head, but before he had a chance to open his mouth, the man jammed his gun against Matt's forehead. "I hope you weren't about to refuse. We don't take kindly to those who don't cooperate." "Who are you talking to, Will?" one of the men called out. The man holding Matt hostage, Will, looked in the direction of his buddies, who were on the next aisle over. "I got it handled." That's when Derek came out of nowhere, slamming the butt of his gun into Will's head. Will crumpled to the floor. Matt exhaled, his heart hammering wildly. And when Derek looked meaningfully at Matt's gun lying on the floor, Matt snatched it from the ground. Derek zip-tied Will's hands behind his back, then lifted Will by the shoulders and looked at Matt with raised eyebrows. Feeling like he was slow on the uptake, Matt hustled over to Will, grabbing him by the ankles and helping Derek carry the man to an area several aisles over. Once they dropped him off, Derek whispered, "There are 2 more. You take one, and I'll take the other." Did Derek expect him to take one of the men down? Matt's eyes widened, but before he could protest, Derek trotted away to approach the men from another direction, and Matt was left trying to figure out what to do next. It didn't take him long. "Will!" one of the men called out. "Get over here!" When no one replied, Matt heard the man growl, "Go get him!" Knowing everything was about to hit the fan, Matt hurried to the end of the aisle where he would be hidden from view, but would still be able to see the man who'd been sent to fetch Will. "He's not here," the man called out. No one replied. The man looked slightly worried as he turned in the direction he'd come from. "Ollie?" Derek must have done his part by taking out Ollie, and now it was Matt's turn. He watched the man, whose face was clouding with alarm. The man turned this way and that before freezing in place. evidently listening, his back to Matt. Time for Matt to make his move. Quieter than he'd ever been in his life, Matt crept into the aisle and toward the man, who was about 20 feet away. As he got closer, he saw that the man held a pistol in his right hand. Terrified that the man would see him before he'd gotten close enough to neutralize him, and that the man would then shoot him, Matt found it hard to put one foot in front of the other, especially since his legs were trying to turn him around and go the other way, to safety. But he had to do this. He had to prove not only to Derek, but to himself that he had the guts to do what had to be done. The first man, Will, had been more than willing to shoot Matt, had plainly stated that he could do whatever he wanted. Did his buddies feel the same way? Matt could only assume so. 5 feet away. 3 feet. The man turned, and the moment his eyes met Matt's, they widened with panic. The man dropped his gun, and that's when Matt realized he was pointing his .45 at the man. "On the ground," Matt said, surprised at how calm he felt. "Face down." The man dropped to the floor and pressed his cheek to the cold concrete. "Hands behind your back," Matt said. Crap, he didn't have a zip tie. Where was Derek? Moments later, he came around the corner, wearing a grin. Derek looked at the man on the floor and at Matt standing over him and nodded with approval, then handed a zip tie to Matt, who put it around the man's wrists. "Found some rope," Derek said, before tossing it to Matt. "What do you want me to—" He let his words trail off. Duh. The man needed to be tied to something so that he didn't run out of the place and get help to chase Matt and Derek down. After Matt secured the man to the shelving unit that was bolted to the floor, he turned to Derek with a smile. "Let's go shopping." By the time they left, they'd gathered a number of supplies, including the vegetable seed packets Jessica had requested, along with potting soil and seed starting trays. Derek brought his truck right up to the front entrance, where they loaded everything up. Before they drove off, they checked on the 3 men they'd tied up. All 3 were spitting mad, swearing and threatening Matt and Derek, but besides a bump on the heads of 2 of the men, they were okay. As they walked toward the exit, Matt spoke quietly. "Should we have cut the zip ties?" Derek laughed. "If they're smart, they'll figure how to get loose." Glad he hadn't had to shoot anyone, Matt worried that the time would come when he would have to kill or be killed. He was just grateful it hadn't been that day. Chapter 27. Jessica. Jessica wished she'd suggested Matt take the walkie-talkie with him. That way she could at least try to contact him. He'd been gone for hours, and as each minute ticked by, her worry multiplied. A knock on the door startled her. Leaping to her feet, she raced to the front window to see if she could tell who it was. A woman holding a handful of flyers walked across her lawn and to the neighbor's house. "Who is that?" Kayla asked, as she joined her mother at the window. Brooke was right behind her. Jessica watched the woman until she was out of sight. "Someone dropping off flyers. Do you want me to get it?" Kayla asked. "No," Jessica said. As she turned to her daughter with a smile, she placed a hand on her arm. "I'll get it." Then, after putting on gloves, she went to the front door and opened it a crack. A flyer fluttered to the floor. Jessica picked it up, noticing it was written by hand, which made sense since computers and printers would no longer work. Then she closed and locked the door. "What's it say?" Kayla asked. Jessica read it out loud. "Neighborhood meeting to discuss an important matter, 6 p.m. at the school." She looked at Kayla. "I wonder what the important matter is." Kayla shrugged. "Are we going to go?" "Go where?" Dylan asked, as he walked into the room. Then he pointed to the flyer. "What's that?" Jessica read it to him. "Maybe it has something to do with that man who tried to break in?" Brooke said. Jessica nodded. you're probably right. Then we should definitely go, Kayla said. What about Dad? Dylan asked, which reminded Jessica of her worry. She glanced at her watch. She'd had to dig it out of her dresser since she hadn't worn it in ages. She'd become dependent on her phone to tell her the time and had stopped wearing it. It was nearly 2 o'clock. Trying to reassure the kids as much as herself, she said, "I'm sure Dad will be home soon. We'll see what he says." 45 minutes later, Matt and Derek arrived. The moment she heard Derek's truck, she looked heavenward in gratitude. Then she raced outside to make sure Matt was okay. Then, to her surprise, she found him more than okay. He was in a fantastic mood. As soon as he stepped out of the truck, she threw her arms around him. "I've been so worried." He kissed her soundly. "I'm home now, and I figured out a solution to our security problem." His enthusiasm was contagious. "Oh yeah? What?" Grinning, he said, "Take a look at these." He went to the bed of the truck and opened the tailgate. A number of black steel window security bars were stacked inside. "Oh, that's perfect." Thrilled that they would have a way to secure their home, relief and calm flowed over her. "That means we can all go to tonight's meeting." Matt tilted his head. "What meeting?" "We got a flyer a little while ago that said there's a meeting at 6 tonight to discuss an important matter." Jessica glanced at Derek, who stood nearby. "Do you think it has something to do with our break-in last night?" Derek nodded. "Probably." "Then we'd better get busy and get these installed," Matt said. He looked at Dylan, who'd joined them at the curb. "Carry these in the house for me, will you?" Dylan got right to work. Then Matt took a small box from the truck's back seat and held it out to Jessica. "Your seeds." She didn't know why she'd thought of asking him to get them at the last minute, but she was glad she had. Now they could plant a garden. She took the box and held it like the treasure it was. "Thank you." Then a new thought occurred to her. Was anyone working there? I mean, were you able to pay for this stuff? She kind of doubted any employees would be that loyal, but she had to know. Not exactly." "What do you mean? Did you just take everything?" "The world's changed," Derek said, as he hefted 3 security bar sets out of the truck and onto one shoulder. "We would have paid if we could have, but the place was abandoned." Then he glanced at Matt, like there was something he wasn't saying. She waited to see if Derek would say more, but when he didn't, she decided she would ask Matt about it later. Right now, they needed to secure their home. And as far as not being able to pay for the things they'd taken, what else were they supposed to do? Their family's safety had to be their top priority. "I need to charge up my drill," Matt said. Remembering their decision not to advertise that they had a source of power, Jessica looked at Matt with raised eyebrows. One side of his mouth tugged up. "I told Derek about the RV's solar panel. Your secret's safe with me," Derek said with a chuckle. Derek had done so much to help her family that Jessica couldn't begrudge him knowing. "If you need to use it," she said, "you're welcome to." "Thanks. I'll keep that in mind." He turned away, carrying the 3 sets of security bars into their house. Jessica helped Matt bring in the rest of the items. Then, after thanking Derek, who left, she fixed something for her family to eat, while Matt took his drill out to the RV to charge it up. After their meal, Jessica watched as Matt and Dylan affixed the security bars to all of the windows on the first floor and the basement. Meant to be secured from inside the house, they had hinges that allowed them to be swung open if access to the window was needed. "It will be a lot harder for someone to break in now," Matt said, as he latched the steel bars covering the front window. "It looks like we live in a prison," Kayla said with disdain. Matt scowled. "Would you rather have someone take all our food?" "No," she quickly said. "I just meant... Never mind." She shook her head and walked away. "She never watched The Walking Dead," Dylan said with complete seriousness. "So, she doesn't know how it is." "How what is?" Jessica asked. Dylan turned to her. How people can get. What people will do for food. Then he grimaced. At least we don't have walkers. He raised his eyebrows. That's what they call the zombies on The Walking Dead. Holding back a laugh, Jessica nodded. I know. I've seen a few episodes. She couldn't dispute what he'd said. People did do desperate and terrible things to get food. She just hoped they wouldn't have to deal with that. Chapter 28. Matt. At a few minutes before 6, Matt and his family left their house and walked the half-mile to the elementary school for the neighborhood meeting. Now that all of his windows had been secured, he felt relatively comfortable leaving the house unguarded. When they arrived at the school, a fair number of people were already there. Many, like his family, wore something over their noses and mouths. When he saw Tony talking to people at the front of the crowd, he was certain Tony had put the meeting together. He didn't see Charlie, though, so he wondered if this meeting actually had anything to do with the break-in. Welcome, Tony said a few minutes later. The crowd quieted. Tony's gaze swept the assembled group. I hate to say it, but I think there are fewer people here than we had at yesterday's meeting. Does anyone know if there were new deaths? No one said anything, but everyone looked around. I was hoping the virus was petering out, he said, but my hope may have been premature. Matt frowned behind his face mask. He'd been hoping the same thing, but since it looked like the virus was still active, he was glad he'd had his family wear protective masks. I think my neighbor got sick, one man offered. He was outside earlier today, coughing, and he's not here now. Tony shook his head. Has anyone, checked on their neighbors to see their status? Matt, like everyone else, shook his head. No one was willing to risk their lives to check on their neighbors. Okay, Tony said. Let's move on. He cleared his throat, then nodded at a man who Matt recalled was one of the 3 men who was ex-military. Chris, Tony said. Chris walked away, going to an SUV parked along the curb. Everyone watched as Chris opened the rear door of the SUV and pulled another man out of the back seat. It was Charlie. Most in the crowd gasped. Had they heard about the break-in attempt? Matt felt Jessica's hand slip into his. He gently squeezed to let her know everything would be okay. So, Dylan murmured beside him, it is going to be about that guy. Told ya, Brooks said. Everyone watched with rapt attention as Chris led Charlie to stand near Tony. You may be wondering why this man is handcuffed, Tony began. A number of heads nodded. I'll tell you why. He pointed at Charlie. This man, Charles Swenson, was caught attempting to break in to an occupied home. A low murmur filled the air. Matt was glad Tony hadn't mentioned that it had been his home that had been involved. He didn't want to get dragged into this. Charles confessed that he'd planned it, Tony went on, waiting until the husband and father would be away before he struck, breaking a window in his attempt. He was only stopped because men on patrol caught him in the act. The murmur of the crowd grew louder. Tonight, Tony said with dramatic flair, it is up to you to decide what should happen to Charles. Why'd you do it? Someone called out. Tony turned to Charlie. What do you have to say for yourself? Charlie shifted from one foot to the other, his gaze glued to the blacktop in front of him. Finally, he looked up, his eyes beseeching. I'm sorry for what I did. I know it was wrong. My family... His chin quivered. They're starving. I was desperate, but I was afraid to go into any of the houses with dead bodies in them. I mean, they still have the virus, right? That's no excuse, one man shouted. Give him a break, a woman said. Why didn't you ask for help? Another man asked. So, you admit it. a man near the front of the crowd asked. Charlie looked at the ground again as he silently nodded. Since law enforcement is non-existent, Tony said, it is up to us to decide what to do with him. He paused. Before you decide, keep in mind that your decision will set a precedent for any future crimes in our neighborhood. We should help him, a woman said. You go right ahead, a man somewhere in the middle said. And when your food is gone, don't come crying to me. No one else suggested giving their food to feed Charlie's family. Though Matt felt sorry for the man and his family, there were other options. Trading, bargaining, scavenging, but outright stealing couldn't be tolerated, especially when it had put his family in danger. What if we pool all our resources? A man shouted. We could divide it among the neighborhood. Spoken like someone who has nothing to lose and everything to gain, another man shouted. I think that's a good idea, a woman said. Tony nodded. Okay. Those who vote for pooling our resources, raise your hands. About 1/3 of the people raised their hands. All right, Tony said. Those of you who voted yes ought to get together and pool your resources to distribute among yourselves. But we're almost out of food, one of the women who'd raised her hand said. Right, a man shouted. Which is exactly why you want those of us who were prepared to contribute. Everyone was silent. Clearly, that's exactly what they wanted. Matt shook his head. What a mess. And it was only going to get worse as more and more people ran out of food, including his family. They should be okay for quite a while, but eventually, they would be in the same boat as those who'd already run out. We've gotten off track, Tony said. What do we do with Charles here? Banish him from the neighborhood, one man suggested. Charlie's head snapped up. You can't do that. I live here just like you. But we didn't try to rob our neighbor, the man who'd made the suggestion shot back. Are you saying you'd let your family starve? Charlie asked, evidently no longer sorrowful for his crime. You'd do nothing while you watched them die? No one replied to that. Matt wondered what he would do in that situation if it came to it. If there was no other way to feed his family, would he steal? Yeah, he would. He would do anything. He figured most everyone else had reached the same conclusion. But he wasn't there yet, and he didn't want a desperate man living in their neighborhood. A man who, for all he knew, would attempt another break-in. But next time, he might bring a weapon. No, he couldn't let that happen. He and his family had been a target once. He couldn't let that happen again. Not knowingly. I second the motion to banish him, Matt said in a loud voice. Everyone turned to look at him. What gives you the right? The woman who wanted to pool resources said with a scowl. Hesitating, but only for a moment, he said, because my house is the one he tried to break into. Eyebrows went up at that. He broke one of my windows, which now leaves me and my family vulnerable. He waited until my family was alone before he struck. He planned the break-in. It was premeditated. If we let him stay, you, he pointed to random people as he spoke, could be next. That got their attention, and several other people agreed that Charlie should be made to leave the neighborhood. All in favor of banishing Charles from the neighborhood, Tony said. Raise your hand. 80% of the hands went up. Tony nodded. You will be escorted out of the neighborhood. What about my family? Charlie asked. They may stay if they choose. He paused. I'll personally make sure they get some food. A look of incredulity swept over Charlie's face. You're making me leave them? No, they can go with you, but they don't have to. Fury replaced the incredulity. This is so wrong. Nevertheless, it is the decision of our people. Breaking in to an occupied house will not be tolerated. Tony gestured with his chin to Chris, who grabbed Charlie by the upper arm and marched him back to the SUV. "Wow," Dylan said. Matt agreed. A week earlier, something like this would have been unheard of. Once Charlie had been led away, Tony faced the crowd. "Does anyone have any other concerns they need to discuss?" No one said a word. Perhaps they were all in shock at the sudden and final verdict that they'd been a part of. "Okay," Tony said. "Thank you for coming." At that, he turned away from the crowd and began speaking to someone nearby. Matt turned to Jessica. "I guess that's it." Her forehead was furrowed. "What's wrong?" "It's just..." She shook her head. "I don't know. How can we banish someone from their own home? It doesn't seem right." Matt thought about the abject panic he'd felt when he'd heard glass breaking at his house mere hours earlier. He hadn't known if his family was hurt or what was going on. That couldn't be allowed. "Do you remember how scared you were when you called me on the walkie-talkie late last night?" Jessica nodded. "Yeah. If we're lenient with Charlie, then what's to stop the next guy from wanting to try the same thing? And the next guy might actually be good at what he's doing. He might get in and hurt you or the kids." Jessica's eyebrows pulled together. "You're right." She was quiet a moment. "I guess I just have to get used to this new world where people do things they wouldn't normally do." Matt thought about what had happened at Home Depot, how the man, Will, had held a gun to his head and had threatened to kill him, how he'd said they lived in the Wild West now. Should he tell Jessica about that? One look at the fear and confusion in her eyes, and he knew this wasn't the time. Chapter 29. Jessica. Over the next 24 hours, things were calm, and Jessica almost began to believe that everything was going to be okay, that everything would somehow work out. Then, in the afternoon, a flyer was delivered to their door. Matt got it and brought it inside, scowling as he read it over. "What's wrong?" she asked, as fresh worry splashed over her. He held up the flyer. "Says there's a meeting in..." He looked at his watch. 1 hour. "And every family who comes is required to bring one food item to donate to the neighborhood cooperative." He did air quotes at that. Neighborhood cooperative? Since when do we have a neighborhood cooperative? Jessica had a bad feeling. She remembered the number of people at the meeting the day before who'd wanted to pool everyone's resources. Was this tied to that? "We don't have a neighborhood cooperative, as far as I know," Matt said with a frown. "Besides, we already gave some food to those 3 families." "What's going on?" Dylan asked, as he joined them in the family room. Matt handed him the flyer. Dylan read it, then tilted his head in question. "Weird." Then he looked at Matt. "Are you guys going?" Jessica was wondering the same thing. Matt looked at her with raised eyebrows. "What do you think?" "Maybe we should, just to find out what this is all about." He nodded. "I agree. Pick out a can of something we have plenty of, and we'll head over in a bit." 50 minutes later, wearing their usual ear-loop masks, she and Matt walked out the door and toward the school. When they got there, they set the can of green beans in a box that had about a dozen other items in it. "Thank you," a man standing beside the box said with a grateful smile. Knowing he or his family was probably in need, she felt better about the donation. "You're welcome." When it was time for the meeting to start, there were around 25 people there, a dozen fewer than had been at the meeting the day before. Was that because people didn't want to bring food, or didn't have any, or because they were sick? Hoping it was the former, Jessica looked around for Tony, but didn't see him. "I wonder where Tony is," she murmured to Matt. He lifted his shoulders in a shrug. A man they'd seen at other meetings stepped to the front of the group. "Thank you all for coming." He glanced at the box of donated food items before facing the group. And thank you for your donations. Where's Tony? Someone called out. The man leading the meeting glanced at the man who'd thanked Jessica and Matt for the food when they'd arrived. Then he looked at the man who'd asked the question. I'm afraid I have bad news. Jessica felt her insides clench. Tony, he passed away earlier today. Now her heart pounded. Someone she'd really liked had died. It was so pointless and tragic. Murmured voices filled the air. The man who'd announced Tony's passing waited until everyone had settled down, then, with a grim smile, said, My name's Eric Lawson. I'm the one who called today's meeting. Intensely interested to see what this meeting was about, Jessica waited to hear what Eric had to say. Do you see Derek? Matt whispered beside her. Jessica looked at everyone, then shook her head. No. He'd been at the other meetings. Interesting that he hadn't come to this one. Jessica pictured him getting sick. Her heart skipped a beat. Derek had helped them so much. The thought of him getting sick and dying made her heart hurt. Maybe he's busy, she said. Or maybe he didn't see the flyer in time. After all, they'd only gotten it an hour earlier. Yeah, Matt said. The reason I called this meeting, Eric said. Then he glanced at 5 men who stood near him like they were all in on whatever was about to happen, is to discuss our new neighborhood cooperative. Jessica recognized one of the men, Chris. He was the one who'd led Charlie to and from the SUV the day before. Cooperative? Someone shouted. What cooperative? Jessica wondered the same thing. In light of what happened with that break-in the other day, I know many of you are concerned about security, but there are more serious security concerns. He looked at Bryant Johnson, the man with the ham radio. Bryant, what is the latest news on that front? All eyes swiveled in Bryant's direction. There have been reports of gangs going into neighborhoods, house to house, taking what they want, killing anyone who resists. Stunned at the news, Jessica felt shivers race up her spine. It was bad enough that Charlie had attempted to break in. He'd been an amateur. The thought of armed gangs, on the other hand, terrified her, especially with 2 teenaged girls to protect. Jessica turned to Matt, who was completely focused on what Bryant was saying. How close to our neighborhood? Someone asked. A couple of miles, at most. Thank you, Bryant, Eric said, drawing everyone's attention back to him. His gaze swept the group. We all have families to protect, but nothing in life is free. Not before this virus, and certainly not now. Especially not now. So, what the cooperative decided is, if you want the benefit of neighborhood-provided security, you need to join our cooperative. He paused as loud voices filled the air. You decided? Someone shouted. This can't be good, Matt said beside Jessica. She nodded as a feeling of foreboding washed over her. Eric held up his hands. After several minutes, everyone quieted down. I'm sure you're all wondering what this cooperative is all about, he said. We will explain. He turned to one of the men who'd been standing to the side and nodded to him. I'm Russ Givens, chairman of the neighborhood cooperative. Hold on, one man shouted. When did this cooperative form, and who put you in charge? Russ smirked. A group of us got together and organized it, got agreements from security and medical personnel to work for us, then decided to invite the entire neighborhood to join. This was sounding more and more ominous to Jessica, but she kept quiet as she waited to hear what they had in mind. How does it work? A woman called out. Russ smiled. I'm about to explain. He paused dramatically. Everyone who joins the cooperative will have access to security and medical care. He gestured to Chris. Chris Jackson, who has combat experience, will head up our security team. He faced the group again. Dr. Larson, who is home treating patients, will head medical. On its face, it sounded good, but Jessica knew there was a catch. She turned to Matt, who looked at her with raised eyebrows. Chapter 30. Matt. Matt waited for the other shoe to drop. There was no way this cooperative would offer their perks without wanting something in return, and he had a feeling he knew what it was. "How do we join?" someone asked. "I'm glad you asked," Russ said, like a used car salesman. "Anyone is welcome to join. In fact, we hope the entire neighborhood will join." He smarmy way. The more the merrier. Matt wondered if Russ had actually been a used car salesman. "Like I said before," Russ continued, "members of our neighborhood cooperative will have full access to medical care and security, two things that are vital in this world." He paused. "Well, just like in the world we've always known, people who provide services need to get paid for those services. Here it comes. That payment will come in the form of food donations to the co-op. Of course. However," Russ said, with what was probably supposed to pass as a compassionate smile, "we know that not everyone has much to give." He paused dramatically. "Which is why your payment will be based on what you have, rather than a flat fee that is the same for everyone." A deep sense of unease settled over Matt. "How will you decide how much we need to pay?" a woman asked. "A member of the committee will take an inventory of your food and then tell you how much you're required to pay." Matt's eyebrows shot skyward. "No way!" several people shouted, as others said, "Forget that." "What if we refuse?" someone asked. Eric stepped forward. "That's certainly your right, but if you're not a member of the neighborhood cooperative, then our security and medical services won't be available to you." Anger burned a trail up Matt's throat. It was extortion, plain and simple. "That's not right," a woman cried out. Russ laughed. "It's the American way." "It's mob tactics," Matt heard himself yell. "Protection for payment. And if we don't pay, are you going to rob us?" He pointed at Russ and Eric and the other men who stood with them. Outrage swept across their faces, but Matt noticed that Chris also looked like he felt some guilt and discomfort. Russ pointed at Bryant. "Didn't you hear what Bryant just said? Gangs are only a couple of miles from our neighborhood. Are you willing to risk your family's safety?" His eyebrows bunched. "What are you going to do if gangs break down your door and take all of your food? And worse, then you'll wish you'd given a tiny portion of your food to the cooperative, because then you'd be safe." Matt scowled beneath his face mask. Even if people joined this cooperative, there was no guarantee their security people would get there in time. Even in the old world, law enforcement wasn't always there at the exact moment they were needed. And that was when there was a way to call them. "How can members of this co-op let you know when they need help?" Matt asked. Russ turned to Chris. "We'll let our head of security answer that." Chris, who looked to be in his early 30s with broad shoulders and a confident demeanor, stepped forward. "There will be round-the-clock patrols, so a security team will always be close by." "Thank you, Chris," Russ said with a self-assured swagger. Then he faced the crowd. "Any other questions?" "What if we don't have any food to give?" a man asked. "There's room for everyone in our cooperative. We would just need to find a way for you to contribute in another way." Russ lifted his gaze to take in the entire crowd. "If your family would like to join the neighborhood cooperative, come see us, and we'll get your name and address and schedule a time for a committee member to stop by and talk to you in your home." Letting these people into his home was the last thing Matt would allow. He turned to Jessica. "Let's go." He began walking away with Jessica beside him, and as they passed through the gathering, others began leaving. But there were many who were telling Eric and Russ that they wanted to join the co-op. Shaking his head in disgust, Matt knew he needed to find Derek and tell him about this latest development. After making sure Jessica made it safely home, Matt got on his bicycle to ride to Derek's house. He didn't want to waste the fuel in his truck. There was no telling if he and his family would need to leave the neighborhood, but if they did, he wanted to be able to get as far as possible before his diesel ran out. Derek lived several streets over. Matt hadn't been there before, and he only knew Derek's address because Derek had told him the day before. Now, as he approached Derek's house on his bike, he saw Derek's truck parked in the driveway. Leaning his bike against Derek's garage, Matt took a deep breath before approaching the house. He didn't know what kind of security Derek had set up, although he was certain he would have some. Walking quietly, although not sneaking, he made his way up the walkway from the driveway to the front door. When he reached the door, he knocked firmly and called out, "It's Matt." Moments later, the door swung open. "Hey," Derek said. One hand pressed to the side of his right leg. Matt's gaze went to the gun held there, and when Derek tucked the firearm into the holster at his waist, Matt relaxed. Derek grinned. "Can't be too careful." Then he stepped back, allowing Matt to enter. "What brings you by?" Matt crossed the threshold. "You need to hear about the meeting I just went to." Derek closed the door with a frown. "I know all about it." Surprised that Derek had known but hadn't come, especially to a meeting that would have such an impact on the neighborhood, Matt raised his eyebrows. "You missed a doozy." A muscle worked in Derek's jaw. "So, they're going ahead with it?" Confused, Matt frowned. "You know about the co-op?" Derek gestured to his living room. Moments later, they were seated across from each other. Derek scowled. "Russ and Eric came to me earlier today to see if I'd head up their new security division." Shocked, Matt said, "I take it you turned them down?" Derek chuckled. "You could say that." "What happened?" "They offered me a nice deal. Head up security in exchange for all the food and supplies I would need. A guy named Chris Jackson is heading it up." That seemed to surprise Derek. "Is that so?" "Yeah. Do you know him?" "Sure do. Dr. Larson is part of it too." Derek shook his head. "I wonder if they approached Jeff." "Jeff?" "Yeah, he's military too." He chuckled. "Interesting that they approached both me and Chris. I've got to assume they asked Jeff." Derek narrowed his eyes. "Was Jeff at the meeting?" "Now that you mention it, no." "Huh. There's something else." Tilting his head, Derek said, "What?" "Tony's dead." Derek recoiled slightly. Then he looked thoughtful. "Interesting. Why do you say that?" He chewed on his lip. "Don't you find it coincidental that he was healthy yesterday, but the same day this cooperative is announced, he's dead?" What was Derek suggesting? Some sort of foul play? If that was the case, what were these people capable of? "Yeah," Matt said after thinking it over. "It is." When Derek didn't say anything, Matt asked, "What are you thinking?" Derek stood. "We need to check on something." "We?" "Okay." After what Derek had done for him at Home Depot, Matt couldn't exactly refuse. The two of them walked out the front door. Derek glanced at Matt's bike with a smirk, then they climbed into Derek's truck. Less than a minute later, they pulled to the curb in front of a house with a bright red X painted on the front door. Nervous about going anywhere near an infected body, Matt stared at Derek. "Whose house is this?" Looking toward the house, then at Matt, Derek said, "Tony's. The body would be fresh. Perfect. And we're here because..." Derek laughed. I just have a feeling. Tilting his head, Matt said, "Does this feeling include a concern that you'll catch the virus that is killing pretty much everyone who gets it?" "Nope." He opened the door and stepped onto the pavement. "This guy's nuts," Matt muttered. Then he got out of the truck. "Guess I am too." "What's that?" Derek said as he strode to the front door. "Nothing." He was just glad he was wearing his mask. He pulled a pair of latex gloves out of his pocket and tugged them on. Chapter 31. Matt. The paint forming the X was obviously fresh, only hours old, a thick drip of red trailing down the cheerful, turquoise-colored door. Derek knocked, then he turned to Matt with an embarrassed smile. Guess no one's going to answer. Matt remembered that Tony had said his entire family had died of the virus. Right. Derek took hold of the knob, but it didn't turn. "Locked," he said with a frown. He took a step back before landing a solid kick on the deadbolt. It took 2 more kicks before the door broke open. The stench hit them immediately. "Huh," Derek said, but Matt wanted to hurl. "Do you find something about the smell interesting?" Matt asked, nearly gagging. They hadn't stepped inside yet, and the body wasn't in sight. "Yeah, if Tony died within the last few hours, I wouldn't expect there to be such an awful smell yet. They said he died earlier today." Derek turned and looked at him. He was alive at the meeting yesterday afternoon. True. Derek stepped over the threshold. Matt reluctantly followed. As they went deeper into the house, the stink increased. Matt threw his hand over the mask covering his nose and mouth and breathed through his mouth. It didn't help. "I think he's in here," Derek said as they approached a closed door at the end of a hallway. Matt braced himself. Even with all the dead and dying, he had yet to see a corpse. Derek opened the door. Matt's gaze shot to the crumpled figure on the floor next to the bed. It was Tony, but something wasn't right. Did people with the virus bleed out before they died? Because blood was everywhere. "Just as I suspected, Tony didn't die of the flu," Derek stated. "He was murdered." Stunned that their suspicions were accurate, Matt felt his heart do a kind of kerthump. This was bad. Very, very bad. Derek pointed to the lamp lying on the floor beside Tony. It was covered in blood. Someone beat him to death. Sickened by the sight in front of him, as well as the idea that this cooperative, if they were responsible, were capable of this, Matt just stared with his mouth hanging open. Derek gestured with his head that they should leave. Matt eagerly led the way out the front door. Gulping in fresh air with a greed he'd never known before, he waited for Derek to follow, but he didn't come out for another 30 seconds. When he did, he closed the broken door as best he could before leading the way to his truck, where they both got in. It wasn't until they'd pulled away from the curb that Derek spoke. His pantry was empty, completely empty. Matt remembered Bryant talking about gangs that were taking what they wanted and killing anyone who resisted. Maybe it wasn't the cooperative at all. Maybe it was one of those gangs. Matt voiced his thoughts. "No," Derek said, with a certainty that surprised Matt. "It was the co-op." "What makes you so sure?" "Think about it, Matt. Yesterday, when someone suggested pooling resources, Tony said that those who wanted to pool resources should go ahead and do it and leave everyone else out of it. If this co-op came to him with the idea you heard today, do you think he would have endorsed it?" Derek had a good point. No, exactly. Which is why they killed him. And as a bonus, they took whatever food he had. The thought of Tony, a man Matt had grown to respect, being bludgeoned to death by the men at today's meeting because he wouldn't agree to their socialist plan made his blood boil. "What should we do?" he asked. "I haven't decided. I want to talk to Jeff first." Matt didn't know the ex-military man, but if Derek did, all the better. The more men with combat experience on their side, the better. Then again, Chris had combat experience, and he'd aligned with the cooperative. Moments later, they were at Jeff's house. He was home, although he was busy cleaning the guns in his impressive collection. Matt marveled at the variety of firearms spread out on his dining room table. Fresh air breezed in from the open windows. "I'd offer you something to eat," said Emily, his girlfriend. "But Jeff's put us on rations." She smirked in Jeff's direction. "We're fine," Derek said with a chuckle. Matt nodded his agreement, then considered the idea of rationing food for his own family. At first, it had felt like they had plenty of food, but with 5 mouths to feed, their supplies were beginning to diminish. They hadn't broken out the freeze-dried food yet, but when they did, it wouldn't last forever. "What's up?" Jeff said, as he ran a boar brush back and forth through the barrel of the pistol he was cleaning. He wore a ball cap backwards on his head, and it looked like he'd given up on shaving. "Wanted to talk to you about the neighborhood cooperative." Jeff stopped what he was doing and looked at Derek with a furrowed brow. "Yeah, they asked me to join their security team, but I told them what they could do with their little co-op." He went back to cleaning his weapon. Matt held down a chuckle, glad these two men felt the same way about the cooperative as he did. Derek glanced at Matt before saying, "Jackson's heading up security for them." That got Jeff's attention. He set down the boar brush and pistol and stood. The man was well over 6 feet. "You're kidding," Derek frowned. "Nope. This group is bad news," Matt added. Jeff needed to know what the cooperative was capable of. Jeff turned to him. "I got that sense when they came by. Said they'd provide food for me. When I asked where they would get it, they said members of the cooperative would donate it." One side of his mouth quirked up. "I doubt those donations would be voluntary." Matt told them what Russ had explained at the meeting. Then he glanced at Derek before saying, "Looks like they don't tolerate resistance." Jeff tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Derek became somber. "Tony's been murdered." Jeff's eyebrows shot up as surprise swept over his face. "Murdered?" "Yeah. Matt and I went to his house before we came over. Found him bludgeoned to death." Jeff stared at his array of weapons. Then he looked at Derek. "Not sure what you want me to do about it." Derek raised an eyebrow. "What if they come after you next?" Tilting his head like that was ridiculous, Jeff said, "I'd like to see them try." Matt knew he wouldn't want to go up against Jeff, but he was still surprised he didn't seem at least a little nervous. Derek just laughed. "Okay, bro. Thanks for the time." "Sure thing." Jeff took a step toward the front door. Clearly, the meeting was over. Disappointed that these guys weren't going to do something about the cooperative, Matt had no choice but to leave with Derek. Once they were back in his truck, Matt said, "Now what?" "Now we have a little chat with Chris Jackson." Chapter 32. Matt. Maybe Derek was going to do something about the cooperative. Then a new idea occurred to Matt. Was Chris the one who'd killed Tony? After all, he was the head of security. Minutes later, they were standing on Chris's front porch, talking to his wife, a woman in her early 30s, with a toddler in her arms, and a boy who was about 6 years old, hiding behind her legs. "Chris should be back any minute," she said, as the little boy with blonde hair wriggled in her arms. She set him down, and he toddled off behind her. Seeing her small children, Matt had a new understanding of why Chris may have agreed to be part of the cooperative. Surely they were going to give food to his family. "How are things going, Amy?" Derek asked. Her shoulders slumped. The truth? Not good. We're nearly out of food. And, she glanced behind her, there are only a few diapers left. Then her face brightened. But things are looking up. This neighborhood cooperative will be a huge blessing. At whose expense? Matt wondered. Derek smiled tightly. Right. Hey, Derek, a friendly voice said from a distance behind them. They turned to see Chris walking up the driveway toward the front door. As he reached them, they stepped back to allow him to pass. He kissed his wife, then turned to Matt and Derek. You were at today's meeting, he said to Matt. Yeah, I'm Matt Bronson. Chris Jackson. He hesitated, but only for a moment. I have to say, people weren't pleased when you basically called the neighborhood cooperative the Mafia. Derek raised an eyebrow at Matt, then turned to Chris with a chuckle. Can you say you're not? Chris motioned to the chairs on the porch. Let's talk. It was a beautiful afternoon, and with no electricity, outside was better than in. The three of them settled into wicker chairs. You should know, Derek began. Russ and Eric came to see me this morning about heading security for their cooperative. Chris stared at him. You saying I wasn't their first choice? Derek shook his head. I have no idea, but that's not the point. Scowling, Chris asked, then what is? I turned them down for a reason. Uh-huh. Clearly, you felt differently. Chris glanced toward his house. I have a family, Derek. A wife and 2 small children. We're almost out of food. He frowned. I get an offer to feed my family? Of course I'm going to take it. Matt couldn't fault him for doing what he believed was best for his family. The truth was, if Matt was nearly out of food, he'd probably join the cooperative too. But the reality was, he had food, but he didn't want to be coerced into giving it away at his family's expense. Matt stared at Chris. What happens if someone not in the cooperative needs help? Like, if you see someone being attacked by these roving gangs we heard about, would you just stand by and watch? Chris shifted in his seat like he didn't want to have to deal with that. I mean, of course not. Then his eyes cut to the side, as if someone from the cooperative might have overheard. Matt noticed the move. What would happen if you did help someone not in the co-op, and Russ or Eric found out? He shook his head. No idea. Then he frowned deeply. Look, I'm just doing this to help my family, okay? I don't like the way it's dividing our neighborhood. Derek made a scoffing sound. You're surprised that happened? I mean, come on. People are going to be forced to give up their food just to keep their family safe? That's not right. Grimacing, Chris said, I didn't make the rules. No, Matt said, cutting him off, but you're benefiting from them, at the expense of those who are weaker than you. Chris frowned at him. I'm not going to let my family starve because some people don't approve of my choices. Why were he and Derek there? Had Derek hoped to change Chris's mind? Then he pictured Tony, crumpled in a pool of coagulated blood. Did you kill Tony? Chris looked at Matt with wide eyes. Derek frowned. What? Chris asked. No. Someone did, Matt said. He looked at Derek for backup. We saw him. Someone beat him to death. Chris looked at Derek in stunned disbelief. Is that true? Either Chris was a good actor or he was telling the truth. Yeah, Derek said with a grimace. It's true. Then Chris turned on Matt. Why in the world would you think I did it? You don't know me. I wouldn't kill a man in cold blood. Matt had no idea who had killed Tony, but someone obviously had. It hadn't been the virus that had killed him. You're head of security for this neighborhood cooperative. Chris narrowed his eyes. I still don't get the connection. Was he being dense? Derek cleared his throat, and both men turned to him. The co-op had the motive. Now Chris tilted his head like he didn't want to believe it. Look, the people who organize the co-op are good people, just like you. I don't believe they would kill Tony or anyone else. Without law enforcement to process the crime scene, it was possible they would never know who had killed Tony. All Matt knew was that he would have to be on his guard. If a murderer was in their midst, none of them were safe. Thinking about that led to thoughts of his family. He wanted to be with them. He stood. "I've got to run." "Yeah," Derek said as he stood. "Me too." "Thanks for talking with us, Chris." Chris stood as well. "We've known each other for a while, Derek. We may not agree on the cooperative, but that's not a reason to be enemies." Derek smiled. "Agree to disagree." Chris nodded, then he turned to Matt. "Best of luck." Matt didn't want any enemies, especially not someone who could possibly step between danger and his family. Matt smiled. "You too." Maybe he should give Chris and his family some of their precious food stores. Then again, he wouldn't be able to give them enough to keep them fed for long, and with the co-op already feeding them, what would be the point? With a final nod, he and Derek walked away. Chapter 33. Jessica. Eager to plant the seeds Matt had picked up, first thing the next morning, Jessica oversaw the family as they worked together to place the seeds in the seed starting boxes that Matt had gotten. It was April, too early in the season to plant outside, but if they got the starts going, they would be able to put the plants in the ground in a few more weeks. Cleo kept nosing her way into the potting soil. Laughing, Jessica gently pushed her away. "She loves to garden," Brooke said with a rare smile, as she added a few drops of water to the soft soil of a tomato plant. Lately, it seemed as if Brooke's melancholy wasn't as constant. Having Cleo helped tremendously. Jessica scratched Cleo's head. "She's a good dog." Once all the starts were done, they lined them up on a high table beside a south-facing window. "That should give them enough sun," Jessica said. "But soon it'll be warm enough to put them on the back patio." "I think it's cool that we're growing our own food," Kayla said with a satisfied smile. Jessica agreed. Now that they couldn't run to the store to get groceries, they were going to have to learn a new way of life. "Who's hungry for lunch?" "I am," Dylan said. "You know I can always eat," Matt said. "We have 2 apples left," Jessica said. "After all our hard work this morning, let's celebrate by having those." She turned to Kayla. "Will you slice them up?" Excitement filled her eyes. "Sure." It made Jessica sad that the opportunity to eat an apple would bring her daughter so much joy. Before, Kayla probably would have said she didn't want it. She hadn't been the best about eating produce. It was too bad that it had taken something so drastic to make her children appreciate the things they used to take for granted. Jessica worked on making sandwiches, using half of their remaining loaf of bread. What would they do once that was gone? Would she be able to get her hands on enough yeast and other ingredients to make her own? She'd never made her own bread before. Would she be able to figure out how to do it? "Ow!" Kayla screamed from where she was working. Jessica turned to see blood dripping from one of Kayla's fingers. "Oh no!" She grabbed the first aid kit they'd stashed in one of the kitchen cabinets. After pulling out a gauze pad, she wrapped it around Kayla's finger. "How bad do you think it is?" Kayla grimaced. "I don't know, but it really hurts." She put gentle pressure on the cut. "What happened?" Matt asked, as he joined them in the kitchen. "Kayla cut her finger." "Let me take a look," he said. Kayla held out her hand, and he carefully unwrapped the gauze. "Looks pretty deep," Matt said. He looked at Jessica. "She might need stitches." Kayla frowned. "Are the hospitals open?" As far as Jessica knew, they were closed. She looked at Matt. "I don't know," Matt said. "But Dr. Larson should be able to take care of it." Jessica looked at Matt sharply. At the meeting the day before, the people running the neighborhood cooperative had made it clear that only members of the cooperative could go to Dr. Larson. Maybe we should check the hospital first, Jessica said. She didn't want trouble with the cooperative. Matt turned to her, his eyebrows furrowed. If it's open, it'll be filled with people who are infected with the virus. She hadn't thought of that, but of course, he was right. They couldn't risk it, not over a cut finger. Okay, can we go see Dr. Larson now? Concern flashed across Matt's face, but he nodded. Yeah. He wrapped the gauze back around Kayla's finger. Look at all that blood, Dylan said with obvious fascination. Frowning, Jessica shooed him away. Dad and I are going to get this taken care of. You and Brooke stay here. Okay, Dylan said. Brooke nodded, then she smiled. I'll keep him in line. Good luck with that, Kayla said with a grin. Jessica walked with Matt and Kayla to the front door. Are we driving? She asked. Yeah, Dr. Larson lives a few streets over. As they drove to Dr. Larson's house, Jessica worried about her agreeing to treat Kayla. She was a doctor, but when she found out they didn't belong to the cooperative, would she refuse? A few moments later, they arrived. A sign on Dr. Larson's front door said she was open to patients and to come right in. The welcoming sign made Jessica feel better, and as she opened the door and crossed the threshold, she felt herself relaxing. Knock, knock, Jessica called out when she didn't see anyone. I'm back here, a female voice called out. Come on back. Jessica led the way to the family room at the back of the house, where she saw Dr. Larson wearing jeans and a t-shirt. It wasn't the typical doctor's attire, but these weren't typical times. Hello, Jessica said. Our daughter Kayla cut her finger. She motioned to Kayla, who looked a little pale. Concern flitted across Dr. Larson's face. Oh no, let me take a look. She led Kayla to a chair, and once she was seated, Dr. Larson turned to Jessica and Matt. What are your names? Matt and Jessica, Matt said. Dr. Larson nodded, then said, Would you please sign the register? She pointed toward a binder lying open on the kitchen counter, then she turned her attention to Kayla. While Dr. Larson examined Kayla's finger, Jessica followed Matt to the binder. He picked up the pen, and without speaking, he pointed to the column headings. They read, Name, Address, Co-op Member Number. Then, with the pen resting on the last column heading, he looked at Jessica with raised eyebrows. She bit her lip. They didn't have a member number. Was that going to be an issue? Matt gently set the pen down and turned away from the register. Jessica's heart pounded. It felt like they were at the hospital with no insurance. They stood with their backs to the binder and watched as Dr. Larson cleaned the cut and expertly stitched it up. When she was done, she wrapped the finger in a fresh gauze bandage and smiled. Then she handed a bottle to Kayla. These are antibiotics to prevent infection. Take 2 per day until they're gone. Thank you so much, Jessica said. Yes, Kayla said. Thank you. Before Dr. Larson had a chance to look at the register and discover they hadn't filled it out, Jessica and Matt hurried Kayla out the door. Chapter 34. Matt. As they drove home, Matt felt a little bit like a thief. He'd taken medical services from Dr. Larson without giving her anything in return. Maybe we ought to bring Dr. Larson some food or something, he said. Jessica bit her lip. What about giving her one of our first aid kits? We have several. Good idea. After dropping Jessica and Kayla off and grabbing one of the small first aid kits, Matt drove back to Dr. Larson's house, then walked inside. Dr. Larson? I'm back here, she said. With the first aid kit in hand, he walked into the family room. When she saw him, she frowned. You didn't fill out the register earlier. Maybe coming back had been a mistake. Yeah. We don't belong to the cooperative. He held out the first aid kit. But I brought this as payment. She looked at the first aid kit a moment before taking it from him. "Thank you. I can always use more medical supplies." She set it on the counter, then turned back to face him. "However, I will have to report this to the cooperative." "Well, crap. Can't you just, let it slide this once?" She smiled sadly. "I wish I could, but if they found out, it would be a problem for me." An image of Tony with his skull bashed in filled Matt's mind. Had the cooperative threatened Dr. Larson? Knowing he couldn't stop her from telling them he'd been there, he softly sighed and shook his head. Then he turned and left. As he drove home, it occurred to him that all Dr. Larson knew about them were their first names. For all he knew, she wouldn't remember those, and their family would manage to fly under the co-op's radar. Just to be safe, when he got home, he told Jessica and the kids his concern, instructing them to lay low. Then he closed all the blinds. He wanted to be able to see any visitors before they saw him. That afternoon, a loud knock sounded at the front door. Cleo barked wildly. "Do you think it's them?" Jessica whispered, wide-eyed as they stood frozen in the living room. Matt didn't know, but he feared that it was. "Let me see what I can see." He went to the blinds covering the front window and lifted a slat slightly, peering out. Russ and Eric stood on the walkway in front of his door. He didn't see Chris, the head of security. Not sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, he debated whether or not to open the door. Dropping the slat back into place, he turned to Jessica, then looked at the kids, who had joined them in the living room. His gaze went to Kayla. Her finger was wrapped in gauze and was on its way to healing, thanks to Dr. Larson. Maybe he could make a deal with the cooperative rather than join it. "Let me handle this," he said. He glanced at Cleo. "Come, girl." He put on a face mask before going to the front door and pulling it open, letting Cleo stand beside him. He held her collar, but when she growled at the men, he didn't correct her. "Good afternoon." Neither man smiled, but Matt noticed them glancing at Cleo with nervous looks. "Good. What can I help you with?" Russ focused on Matt. "We understand your family utilized Dr. Larson's medical services. Is that correct?" Should he deny it? He was certain these guys already knew the answer. Besides, if they saw the gauze bandage on Kayla's finger, they would know that they had. Lifting his chin in defiance, Matt nodded once. "Yes." Russ clenched his jaw, and Eric's eyebrows rose like they were surprised he'd admitted it. Had they expected him to deny it? Cleo seemed to calm, sitting beside Matt. He released her collar. If she lunged at the men, he wouldn't stop her. "As you're aware," Russ said, with a quick glance at Cleo, "only members of the neighborhood cooperative are allowed to go to Dr. Larson." The way he said it, like he was in charge of everything in the neighborhood, rubbed Matt the wrong way, especially when there weren't other options for medical care. What was he supposed to do? Put a Band-Aid on a deep cut and hope his daughter didn't get an infection that could lead her to losing her finger, her hand, or even her life? The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Forcing himself to remain calm, he said, "I disagree." Now Russ's eyebrows shot up. "You disagree? With what? The rule is the rule." Normally, Matt avoided confrontations, but this was ridiculous. It was time to tell these guys what was on his mind. Heart pounding, he said, "You may think you're in charge, but it's an illusion. No one's in charge anymore." "Wrong," Russ said, his tone showing his absolute certainty, which just riled Matt up all the more. "We made a deal with Dr. Larson." "I already paid her," Matt said. Russ laughed. "Yeah, she showed us that pitiful first aid kit." It wasn't the biggest first aid kit, but Dr. Larson had only spent about 20 minutes on Kayla. In this world, the payment had seemed generous. "Since you used the co-op's medical services," Russ went on. You're required to either join or make a payment we determine. Even though it irked him, Matt wanted to try to resolve this amicably. What payment do you have in mind? Russ tilted his head. That depends. Unease growing, Matt asked, On what? On what you have. He narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Eric and I will take a look at your supplies and determine payment. Matt's hackles rose. No! Cleo must have felt the tension because she growled deep in her throat. Matt didn't do a thing about it. Russ glanced at Cleo before meeting Matt's eyes. Then he crossed his arms and lifted his chin. I think you're misunderstanding us, Matt. You've already used the services. Now payment must be rendered. Matt didn't want to have to get ugly, so he would give it one last try. Fine, let's negotiate a price. Russ shook his head and frowned. That's not how this works. Okay, he'd had enough. He was done trying to be reasonable. Gritting his teeth, he glared at Russ. Get the hell off my property. Cleo barked, but even so, neither Russ nor Eric moved. With adrenaline surging, Matt reached into his waist holster, grabbed his .45, and drew down on the men. Now. His voice was deadly calm. Both men raised their hands like they didn't want any trouble and began backing up. You want to do this the hard way? Fine. Matt kept his gun pointed at them, while Cleo barked in her deep, threatening voice. Once the men were out of sight, he holstered his .45 before closing and locking the door. Shaking slightly as the adrenaline seeped away, Matt turned to his family, who all looked terrified. Chapter 35. Jessica. Were those men for real? Had they really thought Matt would allow them to waltz into their house and let them rummage through their things? She hated that he'd had to point his gun at them to make them leave, and now she was terrified that they would be back. Maybe they wouldn't, but she knew that was a false hope. Of course they'd be back. They weren't going to let Matt's defiance stand. If they did, it would topple their entire operation. Why would people go along with them taking their stuff if they found out the Bronson family had gotten medical care without joining the cooperative? Jessica looked at her children. Brooke, who she now considered one of her own, knelt on the floor with her eyes on Cleo, then opened her arms. Cleo raced to her. Kayla had a deep V between her eyes, and Dylan looked like he couldn't decide if he was scared or excited about what was happening. It's all my fault, Kayla said. No, Matt said as he went to her side. It was bound to happen sooner or later. Yeah, but because I cut my finger, she held it up to emphasize her point, it happened sooner. Jessica joined her and Matt. We'll deal with it, sweetheart. A look of determination came over Kayla. Yes. She looked at Brooke and Dylan. All of us will. Together. Brooke looked scared, but Dylan nodded and said, Count me in. That worried her more. She didn't want her children caught in the middle of this. She turned to Matt, but he was looking at the windows. Without comment, he walked to the nearest one and grabbed the security bars, shaking them in an apparent attempt to make sure they were securely latched. He checked each window on the first floor before heading to the basement stairs. Jessica followed him. Maybe we should barricade all the doors. He turned to look at her, his expression saying he was glad she wasn't under the illusion that they were safe. Yeah. Do you think we ought to hide some of our food in case they get in? He nodded. That's not a bad idea. With the kids' help, they barricaded the front door and the sliding glass door as best they could. Next, they took all of the freeze-dried food, which were stored in buckets, and carried them out through the garage to the RV, stashing most of them under Matt and Jessica's bed and some of them in the RV's lower storage area. The last 2 buckets wouldn't fit anywhere, so they took out the Mylar envelopes and stashed them in various places within the RV. Now we just have to hope no one breaks into the RV, Matt said with a frown. Jessica thought the same thing. With the RV behind their fence, hopefully that would deter thieves. But nothing was certain in this world. When they were done, the 5 of them went into the house and barricaded the door to the garage, then put as many cases of canned food under their beds as they could fit, leaving a small amount in the pantry and just a few items in the basement storage room. Now, if they get in, Matt said with a frown, they'll think we only have a little bit of food left. Jessica hoped he was right, but what if they did get in and didn't believe that was all they had? What if they wanted to search the house? The idea of strangers ransacking their house in search of food to steal made her furious. "Can I talk to you?" she said to Matt. "In our room?" "Of course." The 2 of them went into their bedroom. Matt turned to her with a questioning look. "What's up?" "I was wondering if I should, carry a gun?" The idea actually scared her, but what if those men got in and things got out of hand? Matt's eyebrows shot up. "I think that's a great idea, if you're comfortable with it." Softly chuckling, she said, "I'm not super comfortable with it, but what if they get in?" Dread at the thought of those men becoming violent made her heart pound. "I need to be able to protect our children." Matt nodded. "I agree." He went into the closet and took out a small case, setting it on their bed. He opened it, revealing a pistol. "This is a 9mm. Jessica stared at the gun. With its matte black finish and solid barrel, it looked so deadly. "Hold it like this when you rack it," Matt said, demonstrating. "Right now, it's not loaded, but you should always treat a gun like it is." She smiled warmly. "I know. That's what Derek said at his class." He chuckled. "Well, he's right." He held the gun out to her. Gingerly, she lifted it from his hand. She hefted the weight of it. Then she gripped it in her left hand and tried to rack it with her right. It wasn't as easy as Matt made it look. She wasn't nearly as strong as he was. Struggling to rack it, she kept working at it until she felt comfortable. Then she sighted it, pointing it in a safe direction, before turning to Matt. "Where should I keep it?" "Somewhere you can access it quickly, but where it's out of sight." He frowned. "You wouldn't want the bad guys to grab it first." An image of the gun getting into the wrong hands filled her mind. "I also don't want the kids to mess with it." Matt frowned. Was he worried about the kids getting their hands on the gun? Or, more likely, did he want them to have their own, so they could help defend their home? "Let me show you how to load it," he said. Closely watching how he did it, then trying it herself, Jessica found herself becoming more comfortable with handling the gun. Shooting someone was something else entirely, but at least she would know how to use the gun. "Dad!" Dylan shouted as he burst into the room, his eyes like saucers. "A bunch of men are coming down our street!" Matt dashed to the bedroom window. Jessica was right on his heels. They looked out their second-story window, which overlooked the front of their house. "Crap," Matt muttered, while Jessica gasped. "I count 6 men." Jessica did a quick count. "Me too." "They're coming to our house!" Dylan squeaked out. Terror wound its way up Jessica's throat. What were these men prepared to do? Chapter 36. Matt. Matt watched the men marching across his manicured lawn and toward the front door. To his dismay, Chris was among them. He thought of the way they'd barricaded the doors. All of a sudden, it felt incredibly insufficient. Hustling down the stairs, he felt adrenaline dumping into his bloodstream. "What should we do?" Dylan asked. Matt stopped where he was, then motioned toward the back door. "Help me move the barricade." "Why?" "I need you to get Derek." Panic filled Dylan's eyes. What? Trying not to let Dylan's panic capture him, Matt pulled the dining room table away from the door. Help me, son. Dylan did. You want me to go out there? Alone? The door was clear. Matt nodded. You'll be fine. Hop the fence to the neighbor's yard. The men will never see you. He slid the door open. Go. Now. Dylan's eyebrows bunched as he looked at his dad. Then a look of resolve swept over his face. Carl would do it. At that, Dylan raced out the door. Matt watched until Dylan had cleared the back fence. Then he locked the door and rebuilt the barricade. Smiling at Dylan's Walking Dead reference, when Jessica called his name, he spun to look at her. Her eyes were frantic. What's going on? Where did Dylan go? To get Derek. Jessica stared at him a moment, then her shoulders sagged. Okay. Pounding, loud and insistent, sounded on the front door. Matt's heart beat just as hard. He desperately hoped Derek was home. Open up, a voice demanded, or we'll break your door down. Cleo went into a frenzy, barking with wild abandon as she danced in front of the door. Matt looked at Kayla and Brooke. He could tell they were trying to be brave, and as much as he appreciated their support, he didn't want them to get hurt. He motioned for them to go upstairs. Go. Hide. Brooke turned to flee, but Kayla stood her ground. No, we need to stick together. Brooke looked from Kayla to Matt to the front door, her auburn ponytail swinging. Finally, she went to Kayla's side. Kayla's right. Her eyes were wide with fear. What should we do? He only had his .45 and the 9mm he'd given Jessica. Well, he had his rifle, but he wasn't about to hand that to either one of the girls. Not until they had experience using it. He briefly considered giving Kayla his .45, but she had no experience with it either. No, the best option was for him to keep his weapon and for her and Brooke to use something else. The pounding sounded again, with yelling following. This is your last chance. Get my baseball bat, he said to Kayla. Then he strode to the front door and shouted, If you break down my door, I'll blow your freaking head off. A brief pause, then, You're not the only one who's armed, Matt. We've got at least 6 guns pointed at your house. Alarmed, Matt tensed. Jessica touched his arm. Maybe we should open the door. He looked at her sharply. You want to let them in? She shook her head. Of course not. But if we don't open the door, they'll break it down. We don't want a gunfight. What she said made sense. And maybe it was his pride making him want to tell the men on his porch to shove it. But the thought of him giving in and opening the door rankled. Last chance, Matt, a man yelled through the door. Pressure built in Matt's head. He had to make a decision, possibly a life or death decision. I got a bat, Kayla said from beside him. He looked at the trusting face of his 16-year-old daughter. A bat was no match for half a dozen guns. Pushing a smile onto his lips, he said, Turns out a bat won't cut it. He swallowed over the knot in his throat. You and Brooke go upstairs. Stay up there until I tell you to come down. The fear must have been plain on his face, because Kayla nodded, then grabbed Brooke by the hand, and the two of them dashed up the stairs. A deafening boom sounded. The door rattled in its frame. They're breaking it down, Jessica screamed. Matt remembered how easily Derek had broken down Tony's door. Maybe it would be better to face this head on. Stop, he yelled. I'll open it. He turned to Jessica, who stood 5 feet behind him. He waved her to the side. Stay out of their line of fire. Her eyes widened. Do you think they'll shoot? They'd killed Tony. Who knew what they were capable of? Not wanting to give her an answer, he waved her to the side, then he pulled out his .45. Keeping it by his leg, he unlocked the deadbolt, then turned the knob. Chapter 37. Matt. He opened the door slowly, his gaze going to Russ, who stood front and center. Chris was right behind him. Cleo stood next to Matt, trying her best to shove through the door. He didn't want her to get hurt, so he only opened the door about 6 inches. Matt focused on Russ. "You're not coming in." His tone was filled with disdain. Russ frowned like Matt was a wayward child who needed to be taught a lesson. "You gotta cooperate, bro. We don't want this going south. And I don't think you do either." That was true. Even so, there was no way in hell he would let Russ into his house. He would shoot the man first. Matt looked at Chris. He'd seen the way Chris had been torn about being part of the co-op, remembered that Chris had said he'd only agreed to head security as a way to feed his family. Maybe Matt should have made a side deal with Chris to help him and his family out. Then again, his own food supply wasn't unlimited. Then he got an idea. He looked at Russ. "Chris can come in. Only Chris." Chris's eyebrows shot up. Russ stared at him. "Fine." He turned to Chris. "You know what to do." Chris nodded. Someone from behind Chris handed him a small box. Russ moved aside and Chris stepped forward. Cleo's deep barking intensified. Chris looked meaningfully at Cleo before lifting his gaze to Matt. Matt held Cleo's collar. "It's all right, girl." She settled down, and Matt stepped back enough to allow Chris to enter. The moment Chris cleared the threshold, Matt closed and locked the door. "What happens now?" Matt asked, glad Russ had agreed to let Chris come in alone. He didn't want anyone coming in, but he could at least stomach letting Chris in. Chris grimaced. "Now you show me your food supply, and I take some of it." Even though Matt and his family had hidden the vast majority of their food, the idea that an outsider could force his way in, rummage through their personal items, then take what he wanted, ripped a deep streak of resentment right through him. But what could he do? 6 armed men were at his house, and by all appearances, they would take what they wanted by force. Were a few cans of green beans worth dying over? Trying not to grit his teeth, Matt said, "You can look in the pantry." With an expression of discomfort, Chris nodded. "Show me where that is." Matt felt himself tensing up. "This way," Jessica said, saving him from having to say something he might regret. Matt watched Jessica lead the way into the kitchen. He followed Chris, watching with clenched fists as Chris carefully looked over what they had. Chris took out several cans of food, including chili and vegetables, placing them in the box, which he'd set on the counter. He added a packet of crackers to the pile, then turned to them with a tight smile. "Do you have any food in your basement?" Pressure was building in Matt's head. He thought he might explode. This time he couldn't stop his teeth from clenching as he spoke. "You've taken enough." Shaking his head, Chris sighed. "The rule is to take 20% of all food stores." Blood rushed to Matt's face. 20%? Do you want to take one of my kids for slave labor, too? Chris's face reddened as his jaw tightened. "Just show me your basement." More grateful than ever they'd hidden most of their food, he had to slowly breathe in and out, in and out. Jessica placed her hand on Matt's arm. "I'll show him. You stay here." Filled with rage, Matt didn't respond. 5 minutes later, Chris and Jessica emerged from the basement. Chris held half a dozen cans of food. He went to the kitchen counter and set them in the box. Then he picked up the box and turned to Matt. "I'm sorry about this." A look of indecision came over him. "I'm not going to ask if you have food anywhere else." Matt gazed at him. Did Chris suspect they had more, and he was purposefully ignoring that? Feeling his rage dissipating a hair, Matt didn't reply. Instead, he walked to the front door. Chris took the hint and followed. Matt opened the door. Chris went out and handed the box to Russ, who looked over the goods inside. when a smug grin formed on Russ's lips, Matt's rage reignited, and it took all of his self-control not to wipe the expression right off of Russ's face. "Thank you for your donation," Russ said with a smirk. Livid, Matt's nostrils flared. "I assume our family will be covered by your security and medical services now?" Russ's eyebrows went up as he made a scoffing sound. "Afraid not, Matthew. This just covers payment for Dr. Larson's services." He couldn't believe the audacity of these people. First, they demanded that Matt pay them for services that should have been handled between Matt and Dr. Larson. Then they threatened to break his door down and made it clear they would shoot him, and when he let them in, they took whatever they wanted. And now they said the payment only covered the stitches Dr. Larson gave Kayla and nothing else? Blood boiling, rage erupting, Matt couldn't take it any longer. He'd had enough. He stepped onto the porch and lunged for the box of food. Russ yanked it away. "What do you think you're doing?" Russ asked. Matt stood inches from him. "Taking back what's mine." Russ shook his head. "Nope, this is no longer yours. It now belongs to the cooperative." Feeling like his head was about to blast right off of his shoulders, Matt didn't even think before he drew his .45, pointing it in Russ's face. "Wrong. Now set it down and walk away." Russ just laughed. That's when Matt realized that the other 5 men were pointing their guns at him. "Looks like you're outgunned, Matthew. Think again," a deep voice said from behind the men arrayed on Matt's porch. All eyes swiveled in the direction of the voice, including Matt's. A thrill of relief swept over him as a grin curved his lips. Derek, Jeff, Emily, and Dylan stood behind the men, all of them pointing guns at the intruders. Derek and Jeff held 2 guns each, one in each hand. With Matt's gun pointed at Russ, that was a total of 7 guns pointed at the men from the cooperative. Russ looked at Matt, slight panic filling his eyes. With the box held in his hands, he was the only person not armed. "Tell your men to drop their weapons," Matt said calmly. Although his fury was still burning bright, Russ's eyes widened. "You're taking our guns?" Matt grinned. This was so sweet. "Looks that way." Using his chin, he gestured to the box of food. "Put that down, too." Russ's face turned bright red, but he loudly said over his shoulder, "You heard the man." The 5 men set their guns down. "Step back," Derek said, giving the men room to walk past him. Russ looked at Matt, muttering, "You're gonna regret this." Matt had no doubt that this was the start of a war, but it was too late to turn back now. They had to take a stand. Not responding to Russ's threat, Matt chin gestured to the box of food. "Put it down." A muscle worked in Russ's jaw, but he set the box down. "Arms up," Matt said. Russ complied. Keeping his gun fixed on Russ, Matt took Russ's gun out of his waistband. "Join your buddies." Russ glared at Matt. "You and your family won't be in this neighborhood for long." Then he turned and stormed away. Matt watched the 6 men make their way across the grass and down the sidewalk. Once they were out of sight, Matt breathed a sigh of relief. But it was a short breath, because he knew this was only the beginning of their troubles. Chapter 38. Jessica. Jessica's heart was still pounding. What if Derek and the others hadn't shown up when they had? What if a gunfight had ensued? Dylan would have been in the middle of it. Torn between gratitude to Derek and his friends for showing up just in time and anger that Derek had put a gun in Dylan's hands, Jessica stood behind Matt and listened as Matt thanked Derek and his friends for coming. They gathered the guns the men had left, Then Matt introduced Jessica to Derek's friends. "Hi," Jessica said, stepping back to allow everyone to come inside. As Dylan walked past her, wearing a huge grin, she narrowed her eyes at him. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Give that gun back to Derek," she said in reply. "Then go get the girls and let them know it's safe to come down." Disappointment washed over his face, but he gave Derek the gun he'd been holding, then went up the stairs. Jessica went into the family room where the group was assembling. Cleo lay on the floor at Matt's feet. The men set the guns on the coffee table. "These will definitely help," Matt said. Then he looked at Derek and Jeff. "How do you want to divide them up?" "How many do you need?" Derek asked. Matt glanced at Jessica before turning back to Derek. "At least 3. "Take 4, Derek said, as he pushed them toward Matt. "Jeff and I will take the other 2. Not sure if she liked the idea of more guns in the house, Jessica was also torn. If they'd had more guns initially, 1 for each person in their family, they wouldn't have been so outnumbered by the men of the co-op. Of course, she and the kids had 0 experience firing guns, whereas the men of the co-op surely had experience. Still, having extra firearms would be a good start. "Thank you," she said to Derek as she sat beside Matt. "That will help." Matt looked at her in surprise. She slipped her hand into his. They had to be on the same page. If they weren't a team, their entire family would suffer. Dylan and the girls joined them. "What happened, Mom?" Kayla asked. She and Matt recounted the frightening events. Kayla and Brooke listened with shocked faces. "What do you think those guys will do now?" Kayla asked. Jessica wondered the same thing. Derek shook his head. "No doubt they'll retaliate. And since they know how much food you have, you can bet your last can of chili that they want every bit of it." That wasn't what Jessica wanted to hear. Although he was only confirming what she already knew, she thought about Russ's parting words. "They said we won't be in the neighborhood for long." Matt gently squeezed her hand. "They don't get to decide who belongs here." That may have been true, but in the world they lived in now, a group like the co-ops could make it impossible for their family to stay. "We have to be ready for anything," Jeff said. "You'll help us?" Jessica asked, thrilled to know they wouldn't be alone. Emily nodded with a smile. Jeff chuckled. "We're the ones who flanked them. We're in it just as much as you are now." Matt turned to Derek. "Any ideas on what we should do to prepare?" Everyone was quiet as they considered options. All the while, Jessica's heart raced. The men of the co-op had to be furious over what had happened. No doubt they would be thrilled if the Bronson family left, as well as Derek and Jeff and Emily. "I have a plan," Derek said. Everyone looked to him. "Are the houses on either side of yours occupied?" Matt looked at Jessica. She shrugged. "I'm not sure, but I doubt it. I haven't seen anyone around for over a week." "What about the houses across the street?" "Same thing there," Matt said. Nodding, Derek said, "Perfect. We'll scope out the surrounding houses and choose the ones with the best vantage point of your house." Then he looked at Matt and Jessica. "You'll take your family and temporarily move into a neighbor's house." Though she wanted to protest, she decided to hear him out. "I'll stay in a different house," he continued, "and Jeff and Emily will stay in another. That way you'll be out of the target house, and we'll all be in a good position when they strike. That's when we'll strike first." She liked it. Go on offense. Then she frowned. She couldn't believe what she was thinking. The men they were planning on going on offense against were people who were in her neighborhood. Now they were enemies? Then she considered history. During the Civil War, many neighbors had joined ranks, but others had fought against each other. Subtly shaking her head, she focused on the conversation. "We should move anything of value," Matt said, "like food and water, out of this house. There's no telling what they'll do to our house." What did he mean? Did he think those men would destroy her house? Angered and saddened all at the same time, She didn't know what to say. What about the RV? Dylan, who'd been taking it all in, asked. Should we move that? It's pretty valuable. Absolutely, Matt said with a smile. I know a safe place you can store it, Derek said. There's an older house at the end of my street with a barn in the back. One of those houses that was here way before they built our neighborhood. Unfortunately, the man who owns the place didn't make it. But that means it's up for grabs. I checked it out a few days ago, and there's some old junk in the barn, but there's enough room for your rig. Matt nodded. Great idea. Derek turned to Jeff and Emily. Our houses could be targets as well. We ought to gather our food and supplies and stash them in the barn, too. Works for me, Jeff said. Knowing they were all in this together gave Jessica a feeling of being on a team. A very experienced team. Derek stood. Let's check out the houses next door. We need to get ready ASAP. Chapter 39. Matt. Grateful they weren't in this alone, Matt stood as well. Then he turned to Jessica and the kids. Gather all the food in the house, as well as the things we got from Costco and Amazon last week, and put them in the RV. Then we'll have everything in one place. What about our seedlings? Kayla asked. Matt pictured the dozens of trays of seedlings they'd planted. Where would they put them? The RV had limited space. Food had to take priority. I'm sorry, Kayla. We're going to have to leave them. Her face fell. Not wanting to remove all hope, he said, when this thing with the co-op is resolved, we'll come back and they'll still be here. Her face tightened. Then she shook her head before looking away. Whatever. Jessica put her arm around Kayla. We can get more seeds. She threw a small smile at Matt before leading Kayla, Brooke, and Dylan toward the kitchen. Matt turned to Jeff and Derek. Do you think it's wise to put everything in one place? I mean, what if Russ, Eric,